It's a reminder as well that the pandemic is still going on, even though you have had the vaccines and things seem to be turning a corner. The Biden administration, entered into these times, had a very different inauguration than his predecessors. He had a very different campaign than he expected to. The COVID crisis has really colored the campaign and the early days of his presidency, so that will be on display today. Also, what feels so different here on Capitol Hill is kind of how quiet it is. Usually in the beginning of the day, lawmakers stake out spots early. They try to save seats close to the aisle to get a glimpse or perhaps a touch of the president. That is not happening this time around. As Ed and Major know from covering Biden, he is someone who loves to interact on the rope line, who loves to interact with some of his old colleagues here on Capitol Hill. He won't be able to really do that because of the limited number of people in there. But it's also important to note the significance of where Biden will be standing. Just 4 months ago, insurrectionists stormed this very building, trying to overturn or trying to prevent the certification of the results that would declare Biden the official winner of the presidential contest. So whether he acknowledges that tonight remains to be seen, but where he will be standing is a symbol, really, of just how historic this is, not only with the COVID restrictions in place, but just given what took place here in this building. And even just walking into this building, security is still heightened. There are still armed guards, and you still have those who were securing the Capitol that day here on the ground. So another reminder of what happened just 4 months ago.
Right, and the investigation is still ongoing. Ed, earlier you talked about some of the details of the president's American Families Plan that he's going to be unveiling tonight. Why use this particular setting to discuss that?
I think this White House would say, why not? If you've got a captive audience, potentially of tens of millions of people across the country, and you've got Republicans forced to listen to you talk for a little while, why not talk to them about things that they know poll well? More education, expanding child care options and tax credits for people who have children. Talk about popular physical infrastructure plans that are part of the jobs plan as well. And I think it's also because they know ultimately this families plan could potentially end up being the hardest one to sell and the hardest one to get through Congress, given, given that it relies on raising taxes on the wealthiest Americans and on corporations. In such a closely divided Washington, with the Senate divided 50-50, with the House Democrats only having about a 4-seat majority right now, it's very difficult for Democrats to do big, ambitious things without unanimity on the Democratic side and then possibly finding a way to peel off some Republicans if need be. Especially over in the Senate, where Joe Manchin today, the moderate, said he has issues with this plan, hasn't seen all the details yet, and is likely to continue to be a stick in the mud for the president as he tries to get these things passed. So try to take advantage of tonight, see if the big audience and the attention on it helps lift those issues, gets people to, make clear that they support them, and put a little pressure on Republicans to allow the conversations to continue. We should point out that the first meeting among the so-called four corners and the president face-to-face is set to happen now on May 12th. That's about 2 weeks from today. The reason being is because the House is officially out this week and next week and isn't due back until that week. That is when the four leaders, the House Speaker, actually it'll end up being the four corners. No, four corners. I'm sorry. I'm trying to do math on the fly on live television. Never a good thing. The two House leaders, the two Senate leaders, that adds up to four, plus the president, the vice president will get together here at the Oval Office to talk about a host of issues, especially those infrastructure plans.
Well, Caitlin, we have seen Republicans come out in opposition to a number of the president's agenda items, his COVID relief plan, infrastructure plan, now the American Families Plan. Mr. Biden ran on that promise of bipartisanship. So how does he address criticism from Republicans on that topic?
Well, it's interesting. The Biden administration has kind of redefined what they believe bipartisanship is. They say it's not getting support necessarily from those across the aisle. It's getting support from a broad sample of the American public. And so you often hear Biden and his advisors say that while Republicans may not be inclined to support things here on Capitol Hill, that when they look at the polling, they see support for some of these plans among Republican voters. So that's the way that they have been messaging around that. But you talk to Republicans up here on Capitol Hill, and they often gripe about how they have not been able to be included in the legislative process. The COVID relief bill, which was the first major achievement of the Biden presidency in terms of legislation getting through, was passed on partisan lines. They didn't need Republican support because they did it through reconciliation. That could also be the case coming down with this infrastructure bill, even though the White House says that they are meeting with Republicans or soliciting their advice. Republicans have proposed their own proposal on infrastructure that's about a quarter of the size. And as Ed mentioned, Republican leaders and Democratic leaders will be meeting with the president in a couple of weeks. But that's kind of how bipartisanship has been defined by this White House. And they look very heavily at the polling, which shows, at least at this point in time, broad support for the broad parameters of this bill. So you talk to Republicans on Capitol Hill, and they say they are going to try to message on the details of the bill. And on the details, these two sides are still very far apart when it comes to these big pushes legislatively.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns, I know you have to get going. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you later in the evening. Major, let me turn to you. Is it important for the president to reach out to Republican lawmakers and Republican voters in his address tonight? Does that matter?
Sure, and I'm sure he will in some form or fashion. And the White House has had several members of Congress over to the White House. I had one Republican tell me last week that there have probably been more Republicans in the Biden White House by this stage of his presidency than there were Democrats in the Trump White House for maybe the first 2 or 3 years of its presidency. So it is real. The outreach is real. Has it produced actual bipartisan results? Not yet. But for this White House, when it comes to issues like police reform, and Ed outlined where things stand, Karen Bass has been deputized essentially by Speaker Pelosi to cut the deal if a deal is cuttable on police reform. And this underlying issue of whether or not there is liability for police officers or police departments, that's called qualified immunity, is that going to be the ultimate sticking point? Or do you say, all right, we'll figure out some kind of compromise language there, but do all the other things that the George Floyd Reform Act calls for, a national database, national standards, getting rid of chokeholds. Are those overarching goals sufficient for Karen Bass, who the Speaker of the House has said, you will be the one whom this entire House will depend on? Well, that's a legislative process that does not directly involve the White House, but it is interested in that. That shows you how bipartisanship can work. The Speaker said, you can cut this deal, go see if a deal can be cut. That's going to be true on infrastructure, at least on the quote-unquote traditional infrastructure. And the White House has already basically told the country, if Republicans come along, we can find a deal there. And if they don't, the White House knows it has one more reconciliation option available to it this fiscal year, meaning if it can find 50 votes in the Senate from all Senate Democrats and the majority in the House, it can pass an infrastructure bill on its terms, even if all Republicans oppose it. That's not the preferred form, but the White House knows they have that as an option, and Republicans know too. And what the White House also knows is there are many Republicans who, for political reasons and for national reasons, meaning it's good for the country, want to vote for an infrastructure bill, at least traditional infrastructure as Republicans have defined it. And that, the White House knows, is part of this constant conversation, one they're taking much more seriously than they did on the American Rescue Plan. One last thing, Elaine, on this, because it's interesting, the commentary written about the first 100 days of the Biden presidency. There are some historians who've said his agenda might be as ambitious as FDR's ambitions were when he was elected in 1933, took over the presidency in 1933 after the 32 election, or Lyndon Johnson when he was elected in 1964 and approached Congress in 1965. Let me give you a quick statistic. In 1933, FDR had a 22-seat majority in the Senate and a 194-seat majority in the House. Lyndon Johnson had a 36-seat majority in the Senate and a 155-seat majority in the House. Joe Biden has no majority, 50-50 split in the Senate, and as Ed said, effectively a 4-seat. It's actually 6, but 4 to 6, depending on the issue. That's the narrowest majority imaginable for a president, and it is not consistent with the ambitions of his agenda. He is putting out something that many historians who know this much better than I have compared with FDR or Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he's not looking at majorities anywhere near as large as they had to work with.
It's such an important point, Major, the context that you speak of. And as Caitlin said, just the very chamber and the venue tonight is a reminder of the very deep political divisions that exist. The fact that, as Caitlin pointed out, it was just months ago that that very place was the scene of an insurrection. So it's important context for people to keep in mind here as they listen to the outlines of the president's plans. All right, so I want to end with the same question for the two of you. What will you be listening for tonight? Ed, let's start with you.
Sure, and as we do that, I should point out that the White House press secretary, to Major's point earlier, tweeted out tonight that the White House has hosted meetings with at least 130 lawmakers of both parties in the first 100 days. Not all of them met with the president, but they've met with other senior administration officials if they haven't met eye to eye with him. So to that point, that shows you the extent of the congressional outreach so far. Two things I'm looking for. The first happens in the first few minutes. How is the pomp and circumstance of tonight different than years past, given that there are only about 200 people between the floor of the House and up in the gallery? This is a president who likes to grip and grin, somebody who's dreamed of this moment, is well built for these kinds of events that require a lot of that human interaction. That, hey, how are you? Good to see you. How's mom? Can't do that tonight necessarily the way he would normally. So how do they adapt that in the first few minutes here as he heads for the rostrum? The other is the unknown. What is the one thing that happens during the speech, or what is the one piece of news he delivers and announces to all of us that creates days, weeks, or a whole new trajectory of reporting? Is there some surprise in the speech tonight that he will announce? Knowing this White House, how well it works and its communication strategy, there likely is at least one or two of those surprises.
All right, Elaine, Major, what about you?
What I would say is I would say exactly what Ed said about that interaction. And he observed, Ed did many times during the campaign, that there were times where it looked as if then-candidate nominee Joe Biden had some of the life force taken away from him by the social distancing and by the sort of antiseptic nature and the virtual nature of the campaign. And he's become disciplined with all of that. And I think he's going to approach the chamber tonight knowing it's going to be so different, but also setting before the country a rhetoric that says, this is not going to be the way this next address is going to look like. The next time I come back here, it's going to be more normal. And that's going to be another benchmark of our progress as a country. And he will, I think, embody that sense of optimism about, I'm going to come back here again. And the next time I come back here, that life force that I draw so much from in terms of political interaction is going to be here for me. The one thing I'm going to listen to is just how specific and how lengthy he is on the question of immigration, because he is pressurized by the left for not changing nearly enough Trump administration policies when it comes to immigration, and he is pressurized on the right for changing too many and having a crisis on the border. And if you look at the polling data, there is one area in which he is quite clearly, and has been almost from the jump, underwater, and that is on his handling of the border situation. That is a challenge. That's what you call a challenge. It's a managerial challenge for this administration. It's a political challenge for this president. You have one of two choices. Deal with it head on, explain what you're doing and why, what you haven't done, what you won't do, what you're going to do, or try to sidestep it. I'm going to listen very closely to see where this White House lands.
All right, Ed O'Keefe and Major Garrett, always so great to talk to the two of you. Thank you very much.
Take care.
For more analysis, I want to bring in Linda Tran, Leslie Sanchez, and Antoine Seawright. Linda is a CBS News political contributor and a Democratic strategist. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst, and Antoine is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Look at all of you. I'm so happy to be with you guys tonight. It's been a long, long time. So, Linda, we've got a lot to talk about. Let me start with you. Linda, tonight the president will introduce the American Families Plan. He's also released the American Jobs Plan, and Congress passed his American Rescue Plan. All three are trillion-plus dollar pieces of legislation. Were you surprised to see the president go this big right out of the gate with his legislative agenda?
You know what, Elaine, I wasn't surprised at all. These are historic times and they call for historic action. You know, I think about Joe Biden and this administration and what they inherited. And, you know, you can't deny the conjoined crises that he had to take on and tackle. And, you know, certainly the American Rescue Plan needed to happen first to make sure that we were able to get things moving in the right direction in terms of addressing the pandemic and the related economic crisis there. But, you know, look, Ron Klain, his chief of staff, has said that the 4 pillars of this presidency are COVID-19, infrastructure, climate change, and racial inequity. And I think what we're going to hear tonight is a lot of thinking, a lot of vision, and what he plans to do across all of those different fronts. And you also see, of course, those priorities really reflected in every single one of the major legislative plans that he's put forth already.
Well, Leslie, getting Republican support for both the jobs plan and families plan is going to be a tall order. Are there some areas, Leslie, where you see the two sides agreeing? And what would it take for Republicans to agree to tax increases to pay for these plans?
There's not going to be a lot of light and movement on tax increases. Read my lips, no new taxes. Republicans have a long memory about the impact, and that is not a platform and a message they're going to run on. And if anything, Elaine, it very much has been spoken about tonight. That's where Republicans are going to find opportunity to push back, is that this is not the promises that were made in the campaign, many of which Linda talked about, the promises with respect to getting the pandemic under control. You'll have baseline Republicans, many who moved away from the Republican Party, could not stomach another presidency of Donald Trump and moved toward the Biden camp. Many will feel, and many Republicans would agree that they're high marks for the president there. But that's about where the line stops. And there's a lot of question about these massive programs and the massive tax bill that will go with it. Tax bills that affect small mom and pop businesses, many that were on a payment protection plan, small, independent and underserved communities that are trying to, deal with an education crisis, an equity crisis, equality crisis. Racial crisis, and certainly now they're going to have more compounding pressure upon them. And you're also going to have this border crisis where Republicans are going to see that these missteps by the Biden administration fall clearly on his term, his kind of very progressive approach, and also because he has not taken a bipartisan reach across the aisle to work with Republicans. That's going to be their area of criticism, and I think we're going to hear a lot more about that tonight.
Well, Antoine, President Biden is also expected to address police reform and racial injustice. But as you know, some have criticized the president, saying that he has said a lot on these issues, but he hasn't actually taken much action on them. So what are you hoping to hear from the president tonight on that? And what more do you think the administration could be doing?
Well, I think the president has done a handsome job in terms of using his voice and his pulpit in order to advocate for these issues. Look, it's up to the Congress to do majority of the work. This president goes into tonight with 41 executive orders. He goes into tonight with a 58% approval rating, higher approval rating than any president in modern day history in their first 100 days. So I think he's spoken loud and clear about the need for the Congress to act. He's also taking an approach that not many presidents have done in modern day history, and that's trying to pass legislation in a bipartisan way. We know the Justice and Policing Act has passed the House of Representatives as it was before, but now it sits in the U.S. Senate. It's going to take a bipartisan effort in the U.S. Senate. That's why you continue to see this White House and this president bring lawmakers together on both sides to advocate for some of these issues like police reform. When candidate Joe Biden ran, he said, "I am running as a Democratic candidate, but I will govern as an American president." I think his tone and temperature and the way he's taken on some of these issues reflect just that, Elaine.
All right, and we want to show our viewers what is taking place now on Capitol Hill. A live look inside the U.S. Capitol. There you see senators about to head into the House chamber, I'm told, for President Biden's speech. We'll keep an eye on these pictures. There, I believe, is Vice President Harris. As I'm looking here, I have a very tiny monitor. I think that looks like Senator Bernie Sanders and other dignitaries who are now entering that House chamber. And so we'll continue to watch these pictures. And Linda, in the meantime, as we watch these pictures, I do want to ask you about an issue that we have continued to cover here on CBSN. This rise on attacks on Asian Americans, this is something, of course, that the president has spoken out about. The Senate recently passed a bill to help address this particular issue. Do you think that the White House could take further action, and do you expect the president to mention this topic tonight?
You know, I do think he's going to mention it, Elaine. I certainly think he's going to talk a lot about some of the issues around race that we have seen play out in a number of different communities of color across America in recent weeks and in recent months. When it comes to Asian hate, Asian violence, the White House has actually already taken a number of different steps that I believe will begin to lay the groundwork for future progress in this area. You know, certainly there needs to be a societal shift in the way that people think about crime against Asian Americans and the way that people react to violence if and when they see it or experience it. And so what the White House has done so far is they have reestablished the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, which is going to focus specifically initially on bias and violence. They've also established a fund for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault to the tune of $45.9 million. And importantly, they've established an ethics task force to really think about and look through this. You know, at the end of the day, though, Elaine, one of the most important things that this president has already done and will continue to do is to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to draw attention to what is clearly a worsening crisis around the country so that people don't look the other way, so that Asians feel comfortable coming forward and reporting violence that they experience. And all of this, of course, lays the groundwork for that hate crime bill that you mentioned, Elaine, and also the partner version of it that's under markup in the House right now. Certainly expect this White House to throw its support behind that.
All right, for our viewers just joining us, we are continuing to watch those images on Capitol Hill. You saw a moment ago, and we can show you again, the House chamber there. It is going to be a much different picture compared to years past, as we have been saying, a noticeably reduced crowd size there, a place that typically sees about 1,600 people, we are told, in an event like this, now limited to about 200. Now, we are told that in addition to the mask wearing that you see there, there is to be social distancing, although you can tell from this image here that doesn't seem to be happening right at this moment. Nevertheless, those were the guidelines that were outlined to us as conditions of people attending tonight's address. So, Leslie, let me turn to you as we continue to watch these pictures live on Capitol Hill right now. Immigration is one area, certainly, where some have argued that President Biden has fallen short in his first 100 days. He is expected to recommit himself to overhauling the immigration system tonight. How important is it for President Biden to address immigration, and what areas of his agenda do you think show some signs of bipartisan support?
It's such an important question, Elaine, not only because of this rapidly increasing border crisis that's happened as a direct result of changes in the new administration's policies and kind of rolling back asylum numbers, but even the issue of asylum numbers and the fluctuation, the inability to kind of make one position and then stand by that position shows that these are a series of policies that haven't really been thought through with respect to immigration reform. I will tell you there's going to be Republicans who look for things like increasing and maintaining border security, putting caps certainly on asylum seekers, making sure there's strong vetting processes. But the area that's going to get sticky is when you talk about what do we do with the number of undocumented individuals who are here, a pathway to legalization or a pathway to citizenship. There will be a bit of disconnect and debate that goes on about that. And also, again, finally, I think there's consensus on the dreamers and the individuals that have been, through no fault of their own, part of the American system and want to take part in every opportunity as a U.S. citizen and be able to be educated and such in our country. There's agreement on both sides of the aisle to move forward with that. But the president is going to have to make bold moves, take on a lot of special interests within his own party, and really have a plan for how to do this. Republicans have usually led the way, and they've seen the good and the bad that comes from that. It's a very difficult issue to do, and there's a lot of politics involved. But right now, the opportunity is there, especially and I would just end on this, not just because some would say it's a Hispanic issue. I don't believe that. I think it's an American issue. But there are many individuals of Hispanic descent who are watching this administration and how they move forward on this. And Latinos are increasingly becoming the jump ball in elections, So that is also a political layer on top of both parties.
All right. As you've been speaking, Leslie, we saw for a brief moment a shot from the president's motorcade, which we are told has now left the White House and is now making that approximately 2-mile journey now down Pennsylvania Avenue to the U.S. Capitol. We'll bring you some more pictures just as soon as we get them. In the meantime, Antoine, let me turn to you. How difficult of a challenge is this situation at the U.S. southern border for the Biden administration? Because as Major Garrett, as others have pointed out, the pressures on the president on this issue are coming from both the right and the left, criticizing him over his handling of the situation so far.
Well, I think because the president and this White House has not taken their efforts by breaking speed limits to respond to the Republicans' call for what some describe as a crisis to the border, then it becomes a bigger crisis than what it is. Make no mistake, the issues we face at the border did not just happen because Joe Biden became the president. They were there before Joe Biden, and, truth be told, they could be there post-Joe Biden. I think Joe Biden can provide some sort of relief to the American people in terms of how he handles this. But for every crisis we face in this country, I see it as a real opportunity for this president. But what this president and this White House cannot do is allow Republicans to use this as a weapon of mass political destruction or a weapon of mass political distraction, as they have in the past when it comes to typical red meat issues like immigration could be framed to be.
Well, Linda, for the first time, 2 women will be sitting behind the president during this address to a joint session of Congress. How significant will this moment be?
Wow, Elaine, I cannot wait to see those 2 historic women in the frame behind Joe Biden. I mean, there are millions of little girls, my own, who will be watching from all around the country and around the world. And just to be able to see 2 of arguably the most impactful female figures in politics in the last many years, standing there with the president will just be something that I think will be seared into the memories of so many little girls who will have a different view of what's possible for them, what they can do with their own futures, and what kind of country this is that we live in. I think it's going to be magical. I'm definitely looking forward to it.
And there you see on the dais now House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Vice President Harris. Leslie, what are you expecting to hear as we continue to watch these pictures? What are you expecting to hear from the Republicans' rebuttal to the president's speech?
Republicans are going to they're looking for a couple of different things. The first thing they're going to say is, I've heard one Republican lawmaker today, he called it the Biden betrayal. And it was basically not standing by what he ran on during the election, bipartisanship, reaching across the aisle, working on some of these major issues we've just been talking about. But conversely, like we talked about earlier, there are high marks, and Republicans should give the high marks with respect to wrangling to the extent we can, and certainly stronger leadership around the pandemic, around vaccinations, around the rollout, and slowly getting children back to school. Republicans are going to be critical that it's not the way that the president had advocated, saying that all the children are going to be back in school. That was a big thing for Republicans, that it's not the mark there. Those are kind of smaller rumbles, Elaine. The bigger issues for Republicans are going to be the massive tax hikes and the impact it's going to have on the economy, jobs, certainly small businesses and families as they're looking at their pocketbooks. They're going to really exploit those areas and be listening very intently. And that's where you can expect a lot of the pushback to come back tonight. And they are also eyeing, I'm hearing, they've got their eye on midterm elections. They know that when historically presidents take bold initiatives like this, that there is a course correction. The American electorate kind of balances that out with sweeping losses for the party in leadership. They see that as an opportunity as well, and they will look at the price tag and the Biden failure to meet some of those promises as their advantage moving ahead.
All right, there you see Senator Lindsey Graham taking his seat there in the chamber. Antoine, let me turn to you. You know, it is so striking to watch this unfold now, knowing that, as we have pointed out before, this is the very same place when on January 6th, we saw that group of insurrectionists storm this very place and walk around. And I think the question I have for you is about this notion of unifying the country. A lot of the president's campaign platform was built on this idea that he could unify the country. How strong do you think that message has been during his first 100 days? Do you think progress is really being made?
Oh, I think Joe Biden has paved streets and highways of progress in his first 100 days. That's why when you see approval ratings at 58% in the first 100 days by the American people, that's Democrats and Republicans, you get a sense of how the country feels about Joe Biden. When you look at his legislative agenda, every major proposal he's put forth to this point enjoys above 50% support among Democrats and Republicans. I think that speaks loud and amplifies how people feel about Joe Biden. And when you look at what people expect from their leaders, from adjusting the tone and the temperature when needed, and addressing the country at times when the country needs to be addressed, i.e. when a black man is killed or mishandled at law enforcement, and we get to view a tape, when there's a mass shooting, when there's a crisis in this country, the worst crisis since 1918, that's caused some of the worst economic challenges that we have not seen in decades in this country. And you see the response. When you see the ambition that comes from Joe Biden, in terms of a legislative proposal, and you see people may not always agree, but they do not mind working with him to try to meet him halfway. I think that speaks to who Joe Biden is and why he's so critical to this moment. So when he ran for president and said he was fighting for a battle of the soul of this nation, I think what you've seen in these first 100 days is that very clearly.
Linda Tran, as we watch these images and notice the empty seats required by the social distancing protocols that are going to be part of this evening tonight, I wonder what you think the effect of this different dynamic might be, both in how the address itself is sort of received and delivered, not just by those in the chamber, but really for people outside of the chamber who are going to be watching this. You know, one of the things that we always keep tally of, for instance, is the number of times a speech is interrupted by applause, let's say. Well, here you have a noticeably reduced crowd size here because of the COVID protocols in place. How do you think the different dynamics now might affect how the message is received? Do you think that is a factor at all?
Elaine, I keep thinking about those many nights that we spent at Broadcast Center, just watching all of the pomp and theater and circumstance of these joint addresses and State of the Union. And there's no question, with 200 people instead of the typical 1,600, the energy in the room is going to be different. But look, the energy of the nation is different right now. Dramatically different concerns that people have right now than they typically would have in a non-pandemic, dramatic economic crisis environment. And I think what the administration really sees as its priority tonight isn't really the folks in the room, which is a little different than what we've seen in the past. They are making a sales pitch to all of the people watching from around the country. They've been really clear that when they think about bipartisanship, they're not talking about the political tally and the votes on the Hill. They're talking about what Antoine referenced a little bit earlier, the broad support that they're seeing among a broad swath of Americans, from Democrats to Republicans to, importantly, to independents. And we're in a moment right now where a lot of the message research has shown that the American people are much more interested in an active government, much more so than in decades past. And they are looking for the government to actually deliver for them, to do things that make their lives better. That's the message that Joe Biden's going to need to deliver tonight. And that's a message that he's uniquely positioned to deliver in a way that is accessible and something that feels like it aligns with what people at home are feeling right now.
Leslie, let me turn to you on this notion of unifying the country. From your vantage point as a Republican, what do you think that has looked like in the first 100 days of this administration? This idea that Joe Biden campaigned on, that he could bring the country together. What are your thoughts on that?
America was ready for the great American cool down, especially Republicans, many would say, coming off the Trump presidency, for so many reasons. they wanted a different style of leadership that was certainly calmer, more measured, and more effective. And I feel many people feel that within the first 100 days, Joe Biden has delivered on that with respect to the vaccinations, getting those in people's arms, working on vaccination hesitancy, trying to be consistent with the message, daily briefings that we still continue to hear from the CDC. So there's a sense of we can get through this together. And that's what America collectively was looking and listening for. There were some kind of Republicans, Trump Republicans, who were never going to buy into any message that came out of the federal government with respect to this. But overall, this soothing has happened. And that cool down was extremely important. What wasn't anticipated, Elaine, at least by some, was this dramatic pull to the left and this very progressive and expensive price tag. They weren't expecting the border crisis. Some people could say they were wringing their hands, knowing that Biden would fail in this area by removing a lot of the measures that Trump put in place, particularly with respect to border security. And they expected that to happen. But I think what they're looking for, especially people who are deciding between politics of personality versus the traditional party structure, where Republicans are struggling right now, is who's going to be best not only for today and tomorrow, but to get this economy moving for the long term. So again, I'm bringing it back to dollars and the impact on those families. The soothing has happened, and now there's going to be a much more critical eye among Republicans to see, wait a minute, you're offering, it's much bigger than we thought it was going to be, much more expensive, and who's going to ultimately have to pay that bill? That's where Republicans are right now. So there's some that are thinking about how to push back on that, but that's the tone that Republicans are listening to from their constituents.
All right, if you're just joining us now, we've been watching these pictures coming in from Capitol Hill, where, of course, in less than 15 minutes or so now, we expect to see President Biden enter the House chamber there. On the dais right now, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Vice President Kamala Harris. You see, as we continue our discussion here with our panelists, Antoine, let me ask you about just that same question of the dynamic in the room, because earlier our Major Garrett and Ed O'Keefe were remarking on the difference that was noticeable during the campaign. Once the COVID protocols had been established on the campaign trail, their observation was that it did, in fact, seem to affect how Joe Biden was able to sort of interact and communicate. What are your thoughts on that, Antoine? How do you think that this different dynamic might affect what we hear and how the president delivers the message today?
If there's one thing we know, our life experiences dictate how we move forward. Joe Biden has always been viewed as a man and a political figure who understands the importance of being intentional and making adjustments. So just like he made adjustments during the campaign trail, even when he was criticized for being in that basement, he did the right thing. He stayed the course, and as a result, he came across the finish line first. And I think tonight, in his address to the nation and to the world, he will make adjustments in such a way that it would make sense. Elaine, expect tonight to be boring, but boring is the new sexy again in politics. And that's why I think you see this president enjoying some of the high praise among Democrats, Republicans, and independents in terms of how he's handling the country. He knows how to govern. He knows that you cannot campaign the way you govern. And he knows how to make government work for the people and understand that it should be guided by the people. And I think that Joe Biden has spent his career doing that, and that he will continue to do that in his days ahead during this presidency.
All right, Linda Tran, Leslie Sanchez, and Antoine Seawright. So wonderful to talk to you all again. Thank you very much. Take care, guys. And for more, let's bring back Caitlin Huey-Burns. Caitlin is, of course, our CBSN Washington reporter. Caitlin, I know you've repositioned to another location there, but we have been looking at these images in the House chamber, and it's a decidedly, obviously, different feel compared to previous years, where, as you have noted, They would be jockeying very early on for a prime position on an aisle seat in order to have that interaction with the commander-in-chief as he walks down towards the dais. It is a much different atmosphere now. Tell us about that. What is it like to actually be there? Only 200 people in attendance compared to the normal 1,600 or so for an address like this.
That's right, Elaine. Watching those images, I was, wondering, where is everybody? It feels so empty in there. And you know from covering these, and we've been in the room before, that it's usually so packed. Not only do you have the members of Congress, but all of them bring guests. That is not happening this time around. It's very subdued, and in a way, it shows how COVID has really colored this entire presidency so far and Biden's campaign. He had to shift gears when the pandemic hit in March while he was still in campaign season. And as we were talking about in a previous segment, this is a president who really thrives on interacting with people and interacting with a crowd. And as we have been reporting and talking about, this is a president who served for so long here on Capitol Hill and knows a lot of these folks and has had long relationships with them. So these images are quite striking given the COVID restrictions, but also the way in which they mark this moment in Biden's presidency. I was thinking back also to inauguration. Biden is someone who had been running for president for 30 years and had an inauguration that was very different than he might have imagined when he first started this campaign and his others. And so too tonight, a very different address to Congress than he may have imagined while he was running for president. But it also speaks to the way in which this pandemic has been front and center of this administration. And I'm interested to see tonight whether he addresses any new targets in terms of what Americans might be able to look forward to. In his previous address to the nation a couple of months ago, he made a point to kind of give Americans dates to circle on the calendar. July 4th, for example, will be a time that you can gather, with friends and family. Whether he gives any new targets, considering that they have met a lot of the goals that they've set out when it comes to the vaccine distribution, even though they are grappling right now with vaccine hesitancy, which is a real problem, and lawmakers up here will acknowledge that it is in their districts. But this is an administration that has, tried to under-promise and over-deliver. So we'll see if there are any new targets related to COVID today.
Yeah, as you were speaking, Caitlin, the pool was showing a really striking image of the television, literally Klieg lights, shining down upon a sea of empty chairs. So just underscoring what you were talking about, the very different feel. There, I believe, is Senator Marsha Blackburn in her seat, but really underscoring the very different feel of this event that's taking place tonight, which is not a State of the Union, but it is an address to a joint session of Congress, as we have been noting. Very, very limited attendance, and limited as well representatives from various agencies and cabinet officials in keeping with these COVID protocols. Caitlin, I did want to ask you about the symbolism of not just what we're seeing in this chamber, but just more broadly what is taking place at the Capitol, because to get there, I know you have discussed just seeing the continued reminders of the fact that there is an ongoing threat level that exists in Washington and particularly on Capitol Hill. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, Elaine. It's really striking because where Biden will be giving his speech tonight is exactly where just 4 months ago the insurrectionists had stormed the Capitol trying to prevent the certification of the results of the election, which would confirm that Biden won the presidency. So I'm just watching to see kind of whether he addresses that dynamic and the history of that and what the nation witnessed just 4 months ago. And as we've been talking a lot about on Red and Blue, also how it's been 4 months, but the investigation still continues on about what happened then. You're still seeing arrests being made of people who participated in that insurrection that day, and there are still so many questions about how that actually happened. So whether he addresses that in any way will be significant and historic, really. I mean, this is a president who has been to many of these addresses. He was a member of Congress. He first attended one of these in the 1970s. He, of course, attended 8 of them during the Obama administration when he was vice president. But this is the first time that he'll, of course, be president, but also just taking the rostrum in that kind of historic moment, I think, is something really to behold. And I think it's also striking, watching these images that our viewers are seeing on their screen of such a limited audience here in the Capitol. It's also striking that usually Statuary Hall, which is just outside the chamber where lawmakers usually walk through, is completely empty right now. That's usually where we would be kind of staked out in a very crowded scene, kind of all the reporters really tucked in, very tight, lots of cameras, very hot. That is completely empty right now, which also goes to show just kind of how different this feels. So kind of how Biden addresses those two things might be something to watch tonight.
Right. So for viewers, we are just moments away from when we expect President Biden to be announced and enter the chamber. We know that according to our Steve Dorsey, a little bit of color from inside the House chamber. There you see Dr. Jill Biden entering right now. He describes the vibe, Caitlin, as feeling more like, quote, a homeroom gathering for a pledge than the usual buzz of an address to Congress. So, very
That's
much
a great analogy.
a good descriptor there to help people understand the difference in feeling compared to previous years when these kinds of addresses have taken place. Steve Dorsey also reports that the second gentleman has taken his seat in the executive gallery to the left of where Steve is sitting there, and First Lady Jill Biden, as we just saw, walked in. So clearly, it is palpable there, Caitlin.
Absolutely. And a couple of things kind of remain the same, however. As we're watching these images, we're kind of looking to see who is talking to who. Because remember, as we've been talking about, the administration has to get through an infrastructure package through this Congress. So we're kind of like trying to read the tea leaves here about, which lawmaker is talking to who and what that might mean and what those conversations might look like. That's always something that we try to do when we're sitting inside the room. And I think as we're watching those images as well. But great description by our own Steve Dorsey, always bringing the good analogies.
Yes. And we should note, I had said earlier that the president was leaving on the way to the Capitol down Pennsylvania Avenue. I stand corrected. Apparently, according to the radio pool, the president took a more circuitous route. Anyway, not down, for people keeping track of these things, down 17th Street near the MLK Memorial, then up to Independence Avenue along the tidal basin. Let's go ahead and listen in here as we await the president's arrival in the House chamber.
The one from last time. There wasn't. I don't know what to do. That's right. Obama would always have a Obama would always have a They might have one of the copies. Like Obama, remember?
All right, Caitlin, as we await the president's arrival, I'm curious to see how the walk down the aisle is actually going to take place in lieu of people sitting on that aisle because of those social distancing guidelines, how that's going to actually look and feel different as the president walks down. You see that there is the First Lady as well as the second gentleman, the first time, notably, that we have seen a second gentleman taking his seat in an event like this. That is, of course, because Vice President Harris is the first woman to occupy that position of vice president. But, Caitlin, I'm curious to see how that's going to happen, the president coming down and trying to acknowledge all those lawmakers, all while socially distanced.
Yeah, absolutely. It already feels very quiet there. And as our viewers can see, you know, just kind of taking in the historic moment of Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi standing there. That, of course, is the first time that we've seen two women behind the president. But we know that the president is expected to walk in with a mask, take it off while he is giving the speech. But a lot of these speeches are often colored by the reaction in the audience, and that makes a story in and of itself. And so, you know, we won't really have that dynamic and that kind of real feedback in real time about how Congress is responding to what the president is saying. So that's another kind of difference that we'll see. But maybe if someone is more vocal, we may hear directly from a lawmaker. But just kind of taking in that image that our viewers are looking at right now with Harris and Pelosi is something for the history books, to be sure.
And we saw there Democratic leadership walking in, followed by Republican House leadership walking in as well. We should also tell people, Caitlin, there is no designated survivor tonight. Why is that? This is typically a cabinet official that would remain back away from the proceeding. Why is that tonight not the case?
Exactly, and that's a great point, because usually everyone in the cabinet is at the address. And as you saw, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and a couple others from the administration, that's about it. This is a very limited audience, not only in terms of members of Congress, but also who is representing the cabinet. So there is no need for a designated survivor, because there are plenty of them who will be around to take over in the event that anything happens, which a designated survivor is supposed to do. There are a lot of them who are not present at this speech tonight, so there was no need for them. We should also note, too, that you won't see the entire Supreme Court this time around. You'll only see Chief Justice John Roberts, who will be representing the court. You won't see the military top brass. You'll only see the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So a couple of other big differences, in addition to the limit on lawmakers, a limit on cabinet members, and other top officials in government won't be there tonight as well.
Yeah, that we saw earlier. Chief Justice John Roberts entered the chamber a few minutes ago, but it was striking to see the absence, really, of the other justices as something that we have been accustomed to seeing. We've grown accustomed to seeing that in these previous kinds of situations. Caitlin, also, it strikes me that we will likely not see that picture that we're used to of when there is a disagreement about support for a policy that is uttered by a president in an address. It is very visual to see one side of the chamber, to see Democrats either standing or sitting, Republicans standing or sitting, applauding or not applauding. Because things are spread out, that's going to be a different dynamic, right?
Absolutely. It is going to be a different dynamic. I think viewers might remember several years ago during the Obama administration when Congressman Joe Wilson got up and said, "You lie." That became the moment of that particular address. I believe it was last year or the year before when President Trump was addressing policies related to women. You heard a lot of the women in the chamber who were all wearing white kind of stand up and make their voices known. And as we're trying to kind of gauge how this body is responding to this particular president, we won't really see that reaction or hear that kind of same reaction. But heading into these addresses, a lot of the messages from lawmakers are pretty preordained. I mean, their responses are already written in statements. Of course, we'll have a response from the Republican side after this, so we know where people stand.
Madam Speaker.
All right, Caitlin Huey Burns first. Thank you. Let's go ahead and listen in.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and distinct honor to present to you the President of the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good to be back. Mitch and Chuck will understand it's good to be almost home. Down the hall. Anyway, thank you all. Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President. No president has ever said those words from this podium. No president has ever said those words, and it's about time. First Lady, I'm her husband. Second Gentleman, Chief Justice, members of the United States Congress and the Cabinet, distinguished guests, my fellow Americans. While the setting tonight is familiar, this gathering is just a little bit different. A reminder of the extraordinary times we're in. Throughout our history, presidents have come to this chamber to speak to Congress, to the nation, and to the world, to declare war, to celebrate peace, to announce new plans and possibilities. Tonight, I come to talk about crisis and opportunity, about rebuilding the nation, revitalizing our democracy, and winning the future for America. I stand here tonight, one day shy of the 100th day of my administration. 100 days since I took the oath of office and lifted my hand off our family Bible and inherited a nation, we all did, that was in crisis. The worst pandemic in a century, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. Now, after just 100 days, I can report to the nation, America is on the move again. Turning peril into possibility, crisis to opportunity, setbacks into strength. We all know life can knock us down, but in America, we never, ever, ever stay down. Americans always get up. Today, that's what we're doing. America's rising anew, choosing hope over fear, truth over lies, and light over darkness. After 100 days of rescue and renewal, America's ready for a takeoff, in my view. We're working again, dreaming again, discovering again, and leading the world again. We have shown each other and the world that there's no quit in America, none. 100 days ago, America's house was on fire. We had to act. And thanks to the extraordinary leadership of Speaker Pelosi, Majority Leader Schumer, and the overwhelming support of the American people, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, we did act. Together, we passed the American Rescue Plan, one of the most consequential rescue packages in American history. We're already seeing the results. We're already seeing the results. After I promised we'd get 100 million COVID-19 vaccine shots into people's arms in 100 days, we will have provided over 220 million COVID shots in those 100 days. Thanks to all the help of all of you. We're marshaling, with your help, everyone's help, we're marshaling every federal resource. We've gotten vaccines to nearly 40,000 pharmacies and over 700 community health centers where the poorest of the poor can be reached. We're setting up community vaccination sites, developing mobile units to get to hard-to-reach communities. Today, 90% of Americans now live within 5 miles of a vaccination site. Everyone over the age of 16, everyone is now eligible to get vaccinated right now, right away. Go get vaccinated, America. Go and get the vaccination. They're available. You're eligible now. When I was sworn in on January 20th, less than 1% of the seniors in America were fully vaccinated against COVID-19. 100 days later, 70% of seniors in America over 65 are protected, fully protected. Senior deaths from COVID-19 are down 80% since January, down 80% because of all of you. And more than half of all the adults in America have gotten at least one shot. A mass vaccination center in Glendale, Arizona, I asked the nurse, I said, "What's it like?" She looked at me and she said, "It's like every shot is giving a dose of hope," was her phrase, a dose of hope. A dose of hope for an educator in Florida who has a child suffering from an autoimmune disease. Wrote to me, said she's worried, and she was worried about bringing the virus home. She said she then got vaccinated at a large site in her car. She said she sat in her car when she got vaccinated and just cried. Cried out of joy and cried out of relief. Parents, seeing the smiles on their kids' faces for those who are able to go back to school because the teachers and school bus drivers and cafeteria workers have been vaccinated. Grandparents, hugging their children and grandchildren instead of pressing hands against the window to say goodbye. It means everything. Those things mean everything. You know, there's still, you all know it, you know it better than any group of Americans, there's still more work to do to beat this virus. We can't let our guard down. But tonight, I can say, because of you, the American people, our progress these past 100 days against one of the worst pandemics in history has been one of the greatest logistical achievements this country's ever seen. What else have we done in those first 100 days? We kept our commitment, Democrats and Republicans, of sending $1,400 rescue checks to 85% of American households. We've already sent more than 160 million checks out the door. It's making a difference. You all know it when you go home. For many people, it's making all the difference in the world. A single mom in Texas who wrote me, she said she couldn't work, but she said the relief check put food on the table and saved her and her son from eviction from their apartment. A grandmother in Virginia who told me she immediately took her granddaughter to the eye doctor, something she said she put off for months because she didn't have the money. One of the defining images, at least from my perspective in this crisis, has been cars lined up for miles. And not people just barely able to start those cars, nice cars, lined up for miles, waiting for a box of food to be put in their trunk. I don't know about you, but I didn't ever think I'd see that in America. And all of this is through no fault of their own. No fault of their own, these people are in this position. That's why the rescue plan is delivering food and nutrition assistance to millions of Americans facing hunger. And hunger is down sharply already. We're also providing rental assistance. You all know this, but the American people, I want to make sure they understand. Keeping people from being evicted from their homes. Providing loans to small businesses that reopen and keep their employees on the job. During these 100 days, an additional 800,000 Americans enrolled in the Affordable Care Act when I established a special sign-up period to do that. 800,000 in that period. We're making one of the largest one-time ever investments, ever, in improving health care for veterans. Critical investments to address the opioid crisis. And maybe most importantly, thanks to the American Rescue Plan, we're on track to cut child poverty in America in half this year. And in the process, while this was all going on, the economy created more than 1,300,000 new jobs in 100 days. More jobs in the first 100 days than any president on record. The International Monetary Fund is now estimating our economy will grow at a rate of more than 6% this year. That will be the fastest pace of economic growth in this country in nearly 4 decades. America's moving forward, but we can't stop now. We're in competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century. We're at a great inflection point in history. We have to do more than just build back better. We have to build back better. We have to compete more strenuously than we have. Throughout our history, if you think about it, public investment in infrastructure has literally transformed America, our attitudes as well as our opportunities. The Transcontinental Railroad, the interstate highways, united 2 oceans and brought a totally new age of progress to the United States of America. Universal public schools and college aid opened wide the doors of opportunity. Scientific breakthroughs took us to the moon. Now we're on Mars. Discovering vaccines gave us the internet, and so much more. These are investments we made together as one country, and investments that only the government was in a position to make. Time and again, they propel us into the future. That's why I proposed the American Jobs Plan, a once-in-a-generation investment in America itself. This is the largest jobs plan since World War II. It creates jobs to upgrade our transportation infrastructure, jobs modernizing our roads, bridges, highways, jobs building ports and airports, rail corridors, transit lines. It's clean water. And today, up to 10 million homes in America and more than 400,000 schools and child care centers have pipes with lead in them, including drinking water. A clear and present danger to our children's health. American Jobs Plan creates jobs replacing 100% of the nation's lead pipes and service lines, so every American can drink clean water. And in the process, it will create thousands and thousands of good-paying jobs. It creates jobs connecting every American with high-speed internet, including 35% of the rural America that still doesn't have it. It's going to help our kids and our businesses succeed in the 21st century economy. And I'm asking the Vice President to lead this effort, if she would, because I know it will get done. Creates jobs building a modern power grid. Our grids are vulnerable to storms, hacks, catastrophic failures with tragic results, as we saw in Texas and elsewhere during the winter storms. The American Jobs Plan will create jobs that lay thousands of miles of transmission lines needed to build a resilient and fully clean grid. We can do that. Look, the American Jobs Plan will help millions of people get back to their jobs and back to their careers. 2 million women have dropped out of the workforce during this pandemic. 2 million. And too often because they couldn't get the care they needed to care for their child or care for an elderly parent who needs help. 800,000 families are on the Medicare waiting list right now to get home care for their aging parent or loved one with disability. If you think it's not important, check out in your own district, Democrat or Republican, Democrat or Republican voters. Their great concern, almost as much as their children, is taking care of an elderly loved one who can't be left alone. Medicaid contemplated it, but this plan is going to help those families and create jobs for our caregivers with better wages and better benefits, continuing a cycle of growth. For too long, we've failed to use the most important word when it comes to meeting the climate crisis: jobs. 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 For me, when I think climate change, I think jobs. The American Jobs Plan will put engineers and construction workers to work building more energy-efficient buildings and homes. Electrical workers, IBEW members installing 500,000 charging stations along our highways so we can own the electric car market. Farmers planting cover crops so they can reduce the carbon dioxide in the air and get paid for doing it. Look, think about it. There is simply no reason why the blades for wind turbines can't be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing. No reason. None. No reason. So, folks, there's no reason why American workers can't lead the world in the production of electric vehicles and batteries. I mean, there is no reason. We have the capacity. We're the brightest, best trained people in the world. The American Jobs Plan is going to create millions of good-paying jobs, jobs Americans can raise a family on. As my dad would then say, with a little breathing room. And all the investments in the American Job Plan will be guided by one principle: buy American. Buy American. And I might note parenthetically, that does not violate any trade agreement. It's been the law since the 30s. Buy American. American tax dollars are going to be used to buy American products made in America to create American jobs. That's the way it's supposed to be, and it will be in this administration. And I made it clear to all my cabinet people, their ability to give exemptions has been strenuously limited. It will be American products. Now, I know some of you at home are wondering whether these jobs are for you. So many of you, so many of the folks I grew up with, feel left behind, forgotten, in an economy that's so rapidly changing. It's frightening. I want to speak directly to you, because you think about it. That's what people are most worried about. Can I fit in? Independent experts estimate the American Jobs Plan will add millions of jobs and trillions of dollars to economic growth in the years to come. It is an 8-year program. These are good-paying jobs that can't be outsourced. Nearly 90% of the infrastructure jobs created in the American Jobs Plan do not require a college degree. 75% don't require an associate's degree. The American Jobs Plan is a blue-collar blueprint to build America. That's what it is. And it recognizes something I've always said in this chamber and the other. Good guys and women on Wall Street, but Wall Street didn't build this country. The middle class built the country, and unions built the middle class. So that's why I'm calling on Congress to pass Protect the Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act, and send it to my desk so we can support the right to unionize. And by the way, while you're thinking about sending things to my desk, let's raise the minimum wage to $15. No one working 40 hours a week, no one working 40 hours a week should live below the poverty line. We need to ensure greater equity and opportunity for women. And while we're doing this, let's get the Paycheck Fairness Act to my desk as well, equal pay. It's been much too long. And if you wonder whether it's too long, look behind me. And finally, the American Jobs Plan will be the biggest increase in non-defense research and development on record. We'll see more technological change, and some of you know more about this than I do. We'll see more technological change in the next 10 years than we saw in the last 50. That's how rapidly artificial intelligence and so much more is changing. And we're falling behind the competition with the rest of the world. Decades ago, we used to invest 2% of our gross domestic product in America, 2% of our gross domestic product in research and development. Today, Mr. Secretary, that's less than 1%. China and other countries are closing in fast. We have to develop and dominate the products and technologies of the future. Advanced batteries, biotechnology, computer chips, clean energy. The Secretary of Defense can tell you, and those of you who work on national security issues know, the Defense Department has an agency called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. The people who set up before I came here, and that's been a long time ago, to develop breakthroughs that enhance our national security. That's their only job. And it's a semi-separate agency. It's under the Defense Department. It's led to everything from the discovery of the internet to GPS and so much more that's enhanced our security. The National Institute of Health, the NIH, I believe, should create a similar advanced research projects agency for health. And here's what it would do. It would have a singular purpose: to develop breakthroughs to prevent, detect, and treat diseases like Alzheimer's, diabetes, and cancer. I'll still never forget when we passed the cancer proposal last year as vice president. Almost $9 million going to NIH. And if you excuse the point of personal privilege, I'll never forget you standing, Mitch, and saying, "Name it after my deceased son." It meant a lot. But so many of us have deceased sons, daughters, and relatives who died of cancer. I can think of no more worthy investment. I know of nothing that is more bipartisan. So let's end cancer as we know it. It's within our power. It's within our power to do it. Investments in jobs and infrastructure like the ones we're talking about have often had bipartisan support in the past. Vice President Harris and I met regularly in the Oval Office with Democrats and Republicans and discussed the jobs plan. And I applaud a group of Republican senators who just put forward their own proposal. So let's get to work. I wanted to lay out before the Congress my plan before we got into the deep discussions. I'd like to meet with those who have ideas that are different, they think are better. I welcome those ideas. But the rest of the world is not waiting for us. I just want to be clear. From my perspective, doing nothing is not an option. Look, we can't be so busy competing with one another that we forget the competition that we have with the rest of the world to win the 21st century. Secretary Blinken can tell you, I spent a lot of time with President Xi. Traveled over 17,000 miles with him. Spent, they tell me, over 24 hours in private discussions with him. When he called to congratulate him, we had a 2-hour discussion. He's deadly earnest about becoming the most significant, consequential nation in the world. He and others, autocrats, think that democracy can't compete in the 21st century with autocracies because it takes too long to get consensus. To win that competition for the future, in my view, we also need to make a once-in-a-generation investment in our families and our children. That's why I've introduced the American Families Plan tonight, which addresses 4 of the biggest challenges facing American families and in turn America. First is access to good education. When this nation made 12 years of public education universal in the last century, it made us the best educated, best prepared nation in the world. It's, I believe, the overwhelming reason that propelled us to where we got in the 20th century. But the world's caught up or catching up. They're not waiting. I would say parenthetically, if we were sitting down, we set a bipartisan committee together and said, okay, we're going to decide what we do in terms of government providing for free education. I wonder whether we'd think, as we did in the 20th century, that 12 years is enough in the 21st century. I doubt it. 12 years is no longer enough today to compete with the rest of the world in the 21st century. That's why my American Families Plan guarantees 4 additional years of public education for every person in America, starting as early as we can. The great universities in this country have conducted studies of the last 10 years. It shows that adding 2 years of universal high-quality preschool for every 3-year-old and 4-year-old, no matter what background they come from, puts them in a position to be able to compete all the way through 12 years and increases exponentially their prospect of graduating and going on beyond graduation. The research shows when a young child goes to school, not daycare, they're far more likely to graduate from high school and go to college or something after high school. When you add 2 years of free community college on top of that, you begin to change the dynamic. We can do that. And we'll increase Pell Grants and invest in historical black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, minority-serving institutions. The reason is they don't have the endowments. But their students are just as capable of learning about cybersecurity, just as capable of learning about metallurgy, all the things that are going on that provide those jobs of the future. Jill is a community college professor who teaches today as First Lady. She's long said, if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. Joe, any country that out-educates us is going to outcompete us. She'll be deeply involved in leading this effort. Thank you, Jill. Second thing we need, American Families Plan will provide access to quality, affordable child care. We guarantee when I'm proposing the legislation, we guarantee that low and middle-income families will pay no more than 7% of their income for high-quality care for children up to the age of 5. The most hard-pressed working families won't have to spend a dime. Third, the American Families Plan will finally provide up to 12 weeks of paid leave and medical leave, family medical leave. We're one of the few industrial countries in the world. No one should have to choose between a job and a paycheck or taking care of themselves and their loved ones or parent or spouse or child. And fourth, the American Family Plan puts directly into the pockets of millions of Americans. In March, we expanded tax credit for every child in a family, up to $3,000 per child if they're under 6 years of age. Over 6 years of age. And $3,600 for children over 6 years of age. With 2 parents, 2 kids, that's $7,200 in the pockets that are going to help take care of your family. And that will help more than 65 million children and help cut child care poverty in half. And we can afford it. So we did that in the last piece of legislation we passed. But let's extend that child care tax credit at least through the end of 2025. The American Rescue Plan lowered health care premiums for 9 million Americans who buy their coverage under the Affordable Care Act. I know that's really popular this side of the aisle. But let's make that provision permanent so their premiums don't go back up. In addition to my family's plan, I'm going to work with Congress to address this year other critical priorities for American families. The Affordable Care Act has been a lifeline for millions of Americans, protecting people with pre-existing conditions, protecting women's health, and the pandemic has demonstrated how badly it's needed. Let's lower deductibles for working families on the Affordable Care Act. And let's lower prescription drug costs. We know how to do this. The last president had that as an objective. We all know how outrageously expensive drugs are in America. In fact, we pay the highest prescription drug prices of anywhere in the world, right here in America. Nearly 3 times for the same drug, nearly 3 times what other countries pay. We have to change that, and we can. Let's do what we talked about for all the years I was down here in this body, in Congress. Let's give Medicare the power to save hundreds of billions of dollars by negotiating lower drug prescription prices. And by the way, it won't just help people on Medicare. Lower prescription drug costs for everyone. And the money we save, which is billions of dollars, can go to strengthen the Affordable Care Act and expand Medicare coverage benefits without costing taxpayers an additional penny. It's within our power to do it. Let's do it now. We've talked about it long enough, Democrats and Republicans. Let's get it done this year. This is all about a simple premise. Health care should be a right, not a privilege in America. So, how do we pay for my jobs and family plan? I made it clear we can do it without increasing the deficits. Let's start with what I will not do. I will not impose any tax increase on people making less than $400,000. But it's time for corporate America and the wealthiest 1% of Americans to just begin to pay their fair share. Just their fair share. Sometimes I have arguments with my friends in the Democratic Party. I think you should be able to become a billionaire and a millionaire, but pay your fair share. A recent study shows that 55 of the nation's biggest corporations paid 0 federal tax last year. Those 55 corporations made in excess of $40 billion in profit. A lot of companies also evade taxes through tax havens in Switzerland and Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. And they benefit from tax loopholes and deductions for offshoring jobs and shifting profits overseas. It's not right. We're going to reform corporate taxes so they pay their fair share and help pay for the public investments their businesses will benefit from as well. We're going to reward work, not just wealth. We take the top tax bracket for the wealthiest 1% of Americans, those making over $400,000 or more, back up to where it was when George W. Bush was president, when he started, 39.6%. That's where it was when George W. was president. We're going to get rid of the loopholes, allow Americans to make more than $1 million a year and pay a lower tax rate on their capital gains than Americans who receive a paycheck. We're only going to affect 0.3% of all Americans by that action, 0.3%. And the IRS is going to crack down on millionaires and billionaires who cheat on their taxes. It's estimated to be billions of dollars by think tanks that are left, right, and center. I'm not looking to punish anybody, but I will not add a tax burden, additional tax burden to the middle class in this country. They're already paying enough. I believe what I propose is fair, fiscally responsible, and it raises revenue to pay for the plans I propose and will create millions of jobs that will grow the economy and enhance our financial standing in the country. When you hear someone say they don't want to raise taxes on the wealthiest 1% or corporate America, ask them whose taxes you want to raise. Instead, who's they're going to cut? Look, the big tax cut of 2017. Remember, it was supposed to pay for itself. That was how it was sold. And generate vast economic growth. Instead, it added $2 trillion to the deficit. It was a huge windfall for corporate America and those at the very top. Instead of using the tax saving to raise wages and invest in research and development, it poured billions of dollars into the pockets of CEOs. In fact, the pay gap between CEOs and their workers is now among the largest in history. According to one study, CEOs make 320 times what the average worker in their corporation makes. It used to be below 100. The pandemic has only made things worse. 20 million Americans lost their job in the pandemic, working and middle-class Americans. At the same time, roughly 650 billionaires in America saw their net worth increase by more than $1 trillion in the same exact period. Let me say it again. 650 people increased their wealth by more than $1 trillion during this pandemic. And they're now worth more than $4 trillion. My fellow Americans, trickle down economics has never worked. And it's time to grow the economy from the bottom and the middle out. You know, there's a broad consensus of economists left, right, and center, and they agree what I'm proposing will help create millions of jobs and generate historic economic growth. These are among the highest values investments we can make as a nation. I've often said our greatest strength is the power of our example, not just the example of our power. In my conversations with world leaders, and I've spoken to over 38, 40 of them now, I've made it known that America's back. And you know what they say? The comment I hear most of all from them is they say, we see America's back, but for how long? But for how long? My fellow Americans, we have to show not just that we're back, but that we're back to stay, and that we aren't going to go alone. We're going to do it by leading with our allies. No one nation can deal with all the crises of our time, from terrorism to nuclear proliferation, mass migration, cybersecurity, climate change, as well as experiencing what we're experiencing now, the pandemics. There's no wall high enough to keep any virus out. And our own vaccine supply, as it grows to meet our needs, and we're meeting them, will become an arsenal for vaccines for other countries, just as America is an arsenal for democracy for the world, and in consequence, influence the world. But every American will have access before that occurs. Every American will have access to be fully covered by COVID-19 from the vaccines we have. Look, the climate crisis is not our fight alone, it's a global fight. The United States accounts, as all of you know, less than 15% of carbon emissions. The rest of the world accounts for 85%. That's why I kept my commitment to rejoin the Paris Accord, because if we do everything perfectly, it's not going to ultimately matter. I kept my commitment to convene a climate summit right here in America with all the major economies of the world: China, Russia, India, European Union. And I said I'd do it in my first 100 days. I want to be very blunt about it. My attempt was to make sure that the world could see there was a consensus, that we are at an inflection point in history. The consensus is if we act to save the planet, we can create millions of jobs and economic growth and opportunity and raise the standard of living of almost everyone around the world. If you watched any of it and you were all busy, I'm sure you didn't have much time. That's what virtually every nation said, even the ones that aren't doing their fair share. The investments I proposed tonight also advance the foreign policy, in my view, that benefits the middle class. That means making sure every nation plays by the same rules in the global economy, including China. In my discussions with President Xi, I told him, we welcome the competition. We're not looking for conflict. But I made absolutely clear that we will defend America's interest across the board. America will stand up to unfair trade practices that undercut American workers and American industries, like subsidies from state to state-owned operations and enterprises, and the theft of American technology and intellectual property. I also told President Xi that we'll maintain a strong military presence in the Indo-Pacific, just as we do with NATO and Europe, not to start a conflict, but to prevent one. I told them what I've said to many world leaders, that America will not back away from our commitments, our commitment to human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to our alliances. And I pointed out to him, no responsible American president could remain silent when basic human rights are being so blatantly violated. An American president has to represent the essence of what our country stands for. America is an idea, the most unique idea in history. We are created, all of us, equal. It's who we are. And we cannot walk away from that principle and, in fact, say we're dealing with the American idea. With regard to Russia, I know it concerns some of you, but I made very clear to Putin that we're not going to seek escalation, but their actions will have consequences if they turn out to be true, and they turned out to be true. So I responded directly and proportionally to Russia's interference in our elections and the cyber attacks on our government and our business. They did both of these things, and I told them we would respond, and we have. But we can also cooperate when it's our mutual interest. We did it when we extended the New START Treaty on nuclear arms, and we're working to do it on climate change. But he understands we will respond. On Iran and North Korea, nuclear programs that present serious threats to American security and the security of the world. We're going to be working closely with our allies to address the threats posed by both of these countries through diplomacy as well as stern deterrence. And American leadership means ending the forever war in Afghanistan. We have without hyperbole, the greatest fighting force in the history of the world. I'm the first president in 40 years and knows what it means to have a son serving in a war zone. Today, we have service members serving in the same war zone as their parents did. We have service members in Afghanistan who are not yet born on 9/11. The war in Afghanistan, as we remember the debates here, were never meant to be multi-generational undertakings of nation building. We went to Afghanistan to get the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11. And we said we would follow Osama bin Laden to the gates of hell to do it. If you've been in the upper Konar Valley, you've kind of seen the gates of hell. And we delivered justice to bin Laden. We degraded the terrorist threat of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And after 20 years of valor, and sacrifice, it's time to bring those troops home. Look, even as we do, we'll maintain over-the-horizon capacity to suppress future threats to the homeland. And make no mistake, in 20 years, terrorism has metastasized. The threat has evolved way beyond Afghanistan. Those of you in the intelligence committees, the Foreign Relations Committee, defense committees, you know well, we have to remain vigilant against the threats to the United States wherever they come from. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are in Yemen, Syria, Somalia, other places in Africa, in the Middle East, and beyond. And we won't ignore what our intelligence agencies have determined to be the most lethal terrorist threat to the homeland today. White supremacy is terrorism. We're not going to ignore that either. My fellow Americans, look, we have to come together to heal the soul of this nation. It was nearly a year ago before her father's funeral when I spoke with Gianna Floyd, George Floyd's young daughter. She's a little tyke, so I was kneeling down to talk to her so I could look her in the eye. She looked at me, she said, "My daddy changed the world." Well, after the conviction of George Floyd's murderer, we can see how right she was if we have the courage to act as a Congress. We've all seen the knee of injustice on the neck of Black Americans. Now's our opportunity to make some real progress. The vast majority of men and women wearing a uniform and a badge serve our communities, and they serve them honorably. I know them. I know they want. I know they want to help meet this moment as well. My fellow Americans, we have to come together to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the people they serve, to root out systemic racism in our criminal justice system, and to enact police reform in George Floyd's name that passed the House already. I know Republicans have their own ideas and are engaged in very productive discussions with Democrats in the Senate. We need to work together to find a consensus. But let's get it done next month, by the first anniversary of George Floyd's death. The country supports this reform, and Congress should act. We have a giant opportunity to bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice, real justice. And with the plans outlined tonight, we have a real chance to root out systemic racism that plagues America and American lives in other ways. A chance to deliver real equity, good jobs, good schools, affordable housing, clean air, clean water, being able to generate wealth and pass it down through generations because you have access to purchase a house. Real opportunities in the lives of more Americans, Black, white, Latino, Asian Americans, Native Americans. Look, I also want to thank the United States Senate for voting 94-1 to pass the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act to protect Asian American and Pacific Islanders. You acted decisively. You can see on television the viciousness of the hate crimes we've seen over the past year and for too long. I urge the House to do the same and send that legislation to my desk, which I will gladly, anxiously sign. I also hope Congress will get to my desk the Equality Act to protect LGBTQ Americans. For all transgender Americans watching at home, especially young people, you're so brave. I want you to know your president has your back. Another thing, let's authorize the Violence Against Women Act, which has been law for 27 years. "27 years ago, I wrote it. It'll close the act that has to be authorized now, will close the boyfriend loophole to keep guns out of the hands of abusers. The court order said this is an abuser. You can't own a gun. It's to close that loophole that existed. You know, it's estimated that 50 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner every month in America. 50 a month. Let's pass it and save some lives. And I need not tell anyone this, but gun violence has become an epidemic in America. The flag at the White House was still flying at half-mast for the 8 victims of the mass shooting in Georgia, when 10 more lives were taken in the mass shooting in Colorado. And in the week in between those two events, 250 other Americans were shot dead in the streets of America. 250 shot dead. I know how hard it is to make progress on this issue. In the 90s, we passed universal background checks, a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines that hold 100 rounds that can be fired off in seconds. We beat the NRA. Mass shootings and gun violence declined. Check out the report over 10 years. But in the early 2000s, the law expired. We've seen daily bloodshed since. I'm not saying if the law continued, we wouldn't see bloodshed. More than 2 weeks ago in the Rose Garden, surrounded by some of the bravest people I know, the survivors and families who lost loved ones to gun violence, I laid out several of the Department of Justice actions that are being taken to impact on this epidemic. One of them is banning so-called ghost guns. These are homemade guns built from a kit that includes directions how to finish the firearm. The parts have no serial numbers, so they show up at crime scenes and they can't be traced. The buyers of these ghost gun kits aren't required to pass any background check. Anyone, from a criminal or terrorist, could buy this kit and within 30 minutes have a weapon that's lethal, but no more. And I'll do everything in my power to protect the American people from this epidemic of gun violence, but it's time for Congress to act as well. Look, I don't want to become confrontational, but we need more Senate Republicans to join the overwhelming majority of Democratic colleagues and close the loopholes required in background check purchases of guns. We need a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. And don't tell me it can't be done. We did it before and it worked. Talk to most responsible gun owners and hunters. They'll tell you there's no possible justification for having 100 rounds in a weapon. What do you think, deer are wearing Kevlar vests? They'll tell you that there are too many people today who are able to buy a gun but shouldn't be able to buy a gun. These kinds of reasonable reforms have overwhelming support from the American people, including many gun owners. The country supports reform, and Congress should act. This shouldn't be a red or blue issue. And no amendment to the Constitution is absolute. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. From the very beginning, there were certain guns, weapons, that could not be owned by Americans. Certain people could not own those weapons ever. We're not changing the Constitution. We're being reasonable. I think this is not a Democrat or Republican issue. I think it's an American issue. And here's what else we can do. Immigration has always been essential to America. Let's end our exhausting war over immigration. For more than 30 years, politicians have talked about immigration reform, and we've done nothing about it. It's time to fix it. On day one of my presidency, I kept my commitment and sent a comprehensive immigration bill to the United States Congress. If you believe we need to secure the border, pass it, because it has a lot of money for high-tech border security. If you believe in a pathway to citizenship, pass it. There's over 11 million undocumented folks, the vast majority of here overstaying visas. Pass it. We can actually, if you actually want to solve a problem, I've sent a bill to take a close look at it. We also have to get at the root problem of why people are fleeing, particularly to our southern border from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The violence, the corruption, the gangs, the political instability, hunger, hurricanes, earthquakes, natural disasters. When I was president, when I was vice president, the president asked me to focus on providing help needed to address the root causes of migration. And it helped keep people in their own countries instead of being forced to leave. The plan was working, but the last administration decided it was not worth it. I'm restoring the program and asked Vice President Harris to lead our diplomatic effort to take care of this. I have absolute confidence she'll get the job done. Now look, if you don't like my plan, let's at least pass what we all agree on. Congress needs to pass legislation this year to finally secure protection for dreamers, the young people who've only known America as their home. And permanent protection for immigrants who are here on temporary protective status who came from countries beset by man-made and natural-made violence and disaster, as well as a pathway to citizenship for farm workers who put food on our tables. Look, immigrants have done so much for America during this pandemic and throughout our history. The country supports immigration reform. We should act. Let's argue over it. Let's debate it. But let's act. And if we truly want to restore the soul of America, we need to protect the sacred right to vote. Most people more people voted in the last presidential election than any time in American history, in the middle of the worst pandemic ever. It should be celebrated. Instead, it's being attacked. Congress should pass H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and send it to my desk right away. The country supports it, and Congress should act now. Look, in conclusion, as we gather here tonight, the image of a violent mob assaulting this Capitol, desecrating our democracy, remain vivid in all our minds. Lives were put at risk, many of your lives. Lives were lost. Extraordinary courage was summoned. The insurrection was an existential crisis, a test of whether our democracy could survive, and it did. But the struggle is far from over. The question of whether our democracy will long endure is both ancient and urgent. As old as our republic, still vital today. Can our democracy deliver on its promise that all of us, created equal in the image of God, had a chance to lead lives of dignity, respect, and possibility? Can our democracy deliver to the most pressing needs of our people? Can our democracy overcome the lies, anger, hate, and fears that have pulled us apart? America's adversaries, the autocrats of the world, are betting we can't. And I promise you, they're betting we can't. They believe we're too full of anger and division and rage. They look at the images of the mob that assaulted the Capitol as proof that the sun is setting on American democracy. But they're wrong. You know it, I know it. But we have to prove them wrong. We have to prove democracy still works, that our government still works, and we can deliver for our people. In our first 100 days together, we've acted to restore people's faith in democracy to deliver. We're vaccinating the nation. We're creating hundreds of thousands of new jobs. We're delivering real results to people. They can see it and feel it in their own lives. Opening doors of opportunity, guaranteeing some more fairness and justice. That's the essence of America. That's democracy in action. Our Constitution opens with the words, as trite as it sounds, we the people. Well, it's time to remember that we the people are the government, you and I, not some force in a distant capital, not some powerful force that we have no control over. It's us. It's we the people. In another era, when our democracy was tested, Franklin Roosevelt reminded us, in America, we do our part. We all do our part. That's all I'm asking, that we do our part, all of us. And if we do that, we will meet the center challenge of the age by proving that democracy is durable and strong. Autocrats will not win the future. We will. America will. And the future belongs to America. As I stand here tonight before you in a new and vital hour of life and democracy of our nation, and I can say with absolute confidence, I have never been more confident or optimistic about America. Not because I'm president, because of what's happening with the American people. We've stared into the abyss of insurrection and autocracy, pandemic and pain, and we, the people, did not flinch. At the very moment our adversaries were certain we'd pull apart and fail, we came together, we united. With light and hope, we summoned a new strength, new resolve to position us to win the competition of the 21st century. On our way to a union more perfect, more prosperous, and more just, as one people, one nation, and one America. Folks, as I told every world leader I've ever met with over the years, it's never, ever, ever been a good bet to bet against America, and it still isn't. We're the United States of America. There's not a single thing, nothing beyond our capacity. We can do whatever we set our minds to if we do it together. So let's begin to get together. God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thank you for your patience. Thank you. Thank you. How you doing? How's Mom? Good. Give her my love. Watch out for that thing. Be nice to you. Grant.
way.
All right, we have been watching President Joe Biden make his first major address to a joint session of Congress. He began by noting the historic nature of the evening, greeting House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Vice President Harris. He said, "Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, no president has ever said those words from this podium, and it's about time." President Biden unveiled his American Families Plan and made his sales pitch for the American Jobs Plan, calling it a blue-collar blueprint to build America. He also discussed how to pay for both of those plans by raising taxes on the wealthiest 1% of Americans and for corporations. And the president discussed the fight against the coronavirus, noting that 220 million vaccine doses have been given to people in his first 100 days. For more, let's turn once again to our CBSN Washington reporter, Caitlin Huey-Burns. She is on Capitol Hill for us. And Caitlin, as we continue to watch President Biden in the chamber greeting lawmakers, I want to get your thoughts on what stood out to you from the president's address.
A couple of dynamics that stood out to me from Biden's address. First, you could tell that he often referenced his familiarity with being in Congress. He repeatedly asked Congress to act on a variety of different issues, from police reform, notably, to immigration reform, to gun legislation, to voting rights. He said Congress needs to act. And he kind of referenced the idea that he had been talking about and legislating on lots of these same issues when he was a member of the Senate years and years ago. And on some issues, he said, you know, we've been talking about this for years, let's get it done. So it was trying to kind of, you know, appeal to lawmakers and their sensibilities as lawmakers, kind of speaking from his own experience there to try to put the pressure on. He also kind of noted the ways in which he believes his plans have broader support than what Congress thinks. And we've talked about this before, the idea of what bipartisanship means to someone like Biden. He says it means support from the public. And so you saw some pressure points being leveraged at Congress, notably on the infrastructure plan. The big sticking point for Republicans is how to pay for it. And so you could hear him kind of put the pressure on them because he wants to raise taxes on those making over $400,000 per year and raise taxes on corporations. So he was reiterating that and trying to kind of put that pressure on Republicans. You mentioned, too, the idea that he said this blue-collar blueprint for his plans. There were many references when he was talking about the economy that I thought were kind of tailored to potentially Trump voters or Republican voters by saying you should, you know, buy America, things that should be made in America, and this blue-collar blueprint kind of speaking to that. And when you talk to progressives here on Capitol Hill, they often say that Biden, you know, can be an effective messenger to those voters, those working class voters who may have supported President Trump. So repeated kind of references there. You also heard him ad-lib a lot. As I was following through on the script, there were moments of ad-libbing. One notable one to me was when he gave a particular nod to Mitch McConnell, when he was talking about the need to put forward cancer research and to cure cancer. He nodded to Mitch McConnell, and that wasn't in the script. He thanked him for naming research legislation after his late son, Beau. And that was significant because, as we've been talking about, he will sit down with McConnell for the first time in a couple of weeks, and other leaders from Congress. So that nod was particularly of interest to me. And he also nodded to the broader body on the recent bipartisan passing of a hate crimes bill, of course, designed to combat the racism that we've seen against Asian Americans. That seemed to be a way to kind of say Congress can do bipartisan things. But of course, on these bigger issues, they're still very far apart. So we'll see if there was anything today that bridged any of those gaps.
I want to bring into this discussion our CBS News Chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett, who is with us as well. And Major, as we continue to keep our eye on what is happening there in the House chamber as the president makes his prolonged exit out of that chamber, let me ask you the same question I asked Caitlin. What stood out to you from his address?
Well, Elaine, let's capture what's going on right now. Based on your point of view, this is either shrewd or tactically manipulative, but the president is making a very slow, elongated departure from the floor of the House chamber. Why is he doing that? Because the Republican response delivered by Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina, won't begin until the president has left the House chamber. The president knows that. His advisors know that. Every Democrat knows that. So whatever the television audience size is, the president is, I think, very intentionally making this a very slow departure to maximize post-game evaluation of his speech and depriving Tim Scott and the Republicans of any immediate momentum that might be gained with a swift response if he made a hasty retreat from the House floor. So I think what's going on right now is very intentional, and as I said, you can judge it to be shrewd or manipulative, but either way, it's a political fact of life. One thing I would say about the speech, Elaine, that I haven't heard many people say yet, I think you could describe this speech as quiet populism. And this is what I mean. Near the end, President Biden made a very strong reference to the government is the people. It is not this alien force or something that is indifferent to your needs. It is us. Government is us, and government can work. Referencing back to the beginning of the speech, saying, with the vaccines, we have met and exceeded our goals, and we're getting our arms around the pandemic. That's government at work. And then when he talked about how to pay for either his American Jobs Plan or his American Families Plan, he said, we are going to tax millionaires and billionaires. And then he went through elaborate statistics about how much millionaires and billionaires have gained financially in the pandemic, while many middle-class and lower-class Americans suffered substantially. That is a straight-up populist message. It sounded softer than Bernie Sanders, for sure, the senator from Vermont, and a one-time rival of Joe Biden for the Democratic nomination. But it is the policy that Bernie Sanders would articulate, not exactly in the voice he would do it, but it is populist nonetheless.
All right, and right on cue there, we saw the president exit the chamber, Major. Perhaps he heard your analysis of the tactical nature, perhaps, of a prolonged exit.
He doesn't need me to say it, Elaine. He doesn't need me to say it.
Caitlin, so let me turn back to you on the notion of what we're going to hear next. Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina obviously is going to be, as we've been saying, giving the Republican response to this address. Give us the context here. The choice for Senator Scott to deliver this message at this time in our American history.
That's right. Well, when the responders are chosen, they're chosen for a particular reason, because they are sending a message that the party that they're representing wants to send. So in this case, Tim Scott is the lone black Republican in the Senate. He is someone who has been working actively on police reform with Karen Bass on the House side. And he is someone who has been considered a rising star in the party, is beloved by his Republican colleagues here on Capitol Hill, and also has gotten some nods from across the aisle. And a lot of people have referenced this speech that he gave to the RNC over the summer, which was a very powerful speech. And he talked about his grandfather being forced to leave school at about third grade to go pick cotton. And he had this line that really resonated about a family going from cotton to Congress in the course of one lifetime. So he has been able to kind of really appeal to his personal story while also touting conservative ideals. And we've seen some excerpts from his team, and we've also seen his team and himself kind of put out videos about what he might be talking about today. And he is going to be talking about how the Republicans believe believe that Biden has governed very far to the left, and you'll hear him talk about schools and other issues. And so that's really the message coming from Republicans. Now, the response to these things, can go well for you, or they can be cursed in some ways. Some who have given the response have not seen their political careers take off. Some others have. So we'll see how he does. But the moment for Tim Scott is certainly a big one, a big stage, and an intentional light on a figure that Republicans, at least on Capitol Hill, want to say represents the future of the party at this point.
And Caitlin, you mentioned that we did get some excerpts from the address that Senator Scott is going to deliver here momentarily, and I'll just read part of that. We've got about 2 minutes left here, but he'll say, "This should be a joyful springtime for our nation. The administration inherited a tide that had already turned. The coronavirus is on the run. Thanks to Operation Warp Speed and the Trump administration, our country is flooded with safe and effective vaccines. Thanks to our bipartisan work last year, job openings are rebounding." Major, in our about 90 seconds that we have until we expect the senator, let me ask you about that framing here. It's something that we have heard from Republicans now time and time again as they defend the Trump administration's response to the pandemic.
Yes, and they highlight the vaccine, and there is no question, I've said it many times, the Trump administration did one thing powerfully right when it came to the pandemic: accelerate as rapidly as possible through all scientific means and through all powers and persuasion of the federal government, creation of not one, but multiple vaccines. That was a success. But the distribution rate, as the Trump administration exited and the Biden administration came in, was about 1 million a day. We're way over that now. That's because the Biden administration took that on, set ambitious goals, and achieved them. You have to say it is a bipartisan effort. One administration did one thing really well, and the incoming administration, taking that good thing, the vaccines, did it even better when it came to distribution. Without those two things working together and cohesively, we're still stuck in the pandemic. One other point, the day before he was inaugurated, Joe Biden and incoming First Lady Jill Biden recognized 500,000 COVID deaths. Less than 5 weeks later, he gave a primetime address recognizing 500,000 deaths. The death rate since then has diminished dramatically. Why? Because vaccines have gotten into the arms of the most vulnerable Americans. That's a Biden administration success story, built on a Trump administration success story. We should regard it, I think, as a country, as a bipartisan success, not exclusively the preserve of one party or another.
Okay. All right, Major, Caitlin, thank you. Here's Senator Scott.
A good man. His speech was full of good words, but President Biden promised you a specific kind of leadership. He promised to unite a nation, to lower the temperature, to govern for all Americans, no matter how we voted. This was the pitch. You just heard it again. But our nation is starving for more than empty platitudes. We need policies and progress that brings us closer together. But 3 months in, the actions of the president and his party are pulling us further and further apart. I won't waste your time with finger pointing or partisan bickering. You can get that on TV anytime you want. I want to have an honest conversation about common sense and common ground, about this feeling that our nation is sliding off its shared foundation and how we move forward together. Growing up, I never dreamed I would be standing here tonight. When I was a kid, my parents divorced. My mother, my brother, and I moved in with my grandparents. 3 of us sharing one bedroom. I was disillusioned and angry, and I nearly failed out of school. But I was blessed. First, with a praying mama. And let me say this, to the single mothers out there who are working their tails off, working hard, trying to make the ends meet, wondering if it's worth it, you can bet it is. God bless your amazing effort on the part of your kids. I was also blessed by a Chick-fil-A operator, John Moniz, and finally with a string of opportunities that are only possible here in America. This past year, I've watched COVID attack every rung of the ladder that helped me up. So many families have lost parents and grandparents too early. So many small businesses have gone under. Becoming a Christian transformed my life, But for months, too many churches were shut down. Most of all, I'm saddened that millions of kids have lost a year of learning when they could not afford to lose a single day. Locking vulnerable kids out of the classroom is locking adults out of their future. Our public schools should have reopened months ago. Other countries did. Private and religious schools did. Science has shown for months that schools are safe. But too often, powerful grown-ups set science aside, and kids like me were left behind. The clearest case I've seen for school choice in our lifetimes, because we know that education is the closest thing to magic in America. Last year, under Republican leadership, we passed 5 bipartisan COVID packages. Congress supported our schools, our hospitals, saved our economy, and funded Operation Warp Speed, delivering vaccines in record time. All 5 bills got 90 votes in the Senate. Common sense found common ground. In February, Republicans told President Biden we wanted to keep working together to finish this fight. But Democrats wanted to go it alone. They spent almost $2 trillion on a partisan bill that the White House bragged was the most liberal bill in American history. Only 1% went to vaccinations, no requirement to reopen schools promptly. COVID brought Congress together 5 times. This administration pushed us apart. Another issue that should unite us is infrastructure. Republicans support everything you think of when you think of infrastructure. Roads, bridges, ports, airports, waterways, high-speed broadband. We're in for all of that. But again, Democrats want a partisan wish list. They won't even build bridges to build bridges. Less than 6% of the president's plan goes to roads and bridges. It's a liberal wish list of big government waste, plus the biggest job-killing tax hikes in a generation. Experts say when all is said and done, it would lower wages of the average American worker and shrink our economy. Tonight, we also heard about a so-called family plan, even more taxing, even more spending, to put Washington even more in the middle of your life, from the cradle to college. The beauty of the American dream is that families get to define it for themselves. We should be expanding opportunities and options for all families, not throwing money at certain issues because Democrats think they know best. Infrastructure spending that shrinks our economy is not common sense. Weakening our southern borders and creating a crisis is not compassionate. The president is also abandoning principles he's held for decades. Now he says your tax dollars should fund abortions. He's laying groundwork to pack the Supreme Court. This is not common ground. Nowhere do we need common ground more desperately than in our discussions of race. I have experienced the pain of discrimination. I know what it feels like to be pulled over for no reason, to be followed around the store while I'm shopping. I remember every morning at the kitchen table, my grandfather would open the newspaper and read it, I thought. But later I realized he had never learned to read it. He just wanted to set the right example. I've also experienced a different kind of intolerance. I get called Uncle Tom and the N-word by progressives, by liberals. Just last week, a national newspaper suggested my family's poverty was actually privilege because a relative owned land generations before my time. Believe me, I know firsthand our healing is not finished. In 2015, after the shooting of Walter Scott, I wrote a bill to fund body cameras. Last year, after the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, I built an even bigger police reform proposal. But my Democratic colleagues blocked it. I extended an olive branch. I offered amendments, but Democrats used a filibuster to block the debate from even happening. My friends across the aisle seem to want the issue more than they wanted a solution. But I'm still working. I'm hopeful that this will be different. When America comes together, we've made tremendous progress, but powerful forces want to pull us apart. 100 years ago, kids in classrooms were taught the color of their skin was their most important characteristic. And if they looked a certain way, they were inferior. Today, kids are being taught that the color of their skin defines them again. And if they look a certain way, they're an oppressor. From colleges to corporations to our culture, people are making money and gaining power by pretending we haven't made any progress at all, by doubling down on the divisions we've worked so hard to heal. You know this stuff is wrong. Hear me clearly. America is not a racist country. It's backwards to fight discrimination with different types of discrimination, and it's wrong to try to use our painful past to dishonestly shut down debates in the present. I'm an African American who's voted in the South my entire life. I take voting rights personally. Republicans support making it easier to vote and harder to cheat, and so do the voters. Big majorities of Americans support early voting, and big majorities support voter ID, including African Americans and Hispanics. Common sense makes common ground. But today, this conversation has collapsed. The state of Georgia passed a law that expands early voting, preserves no excuse mail-in voting, and despite what the president claimed, did not reduce election day hours. If you actually read this law, it's mainstream. It will be easier to vote early in Georgia than in Democrat-run New York. But the left doesn't want you to know that. They want people virtue signaling by yelling about a law they haven't even read. Fact checkers have called out the White House for misstatements. The president absurdly claims that this is worse than Jim Crow. What is going on here? I'll tell you, a Washington power grab. This misplaced outrage is supposed to justify Democrats' new sweeping bill that would take over elections for all 50 states. It would send public funds to political campaigns you disagree with and make the bipartisan Federal Elections Commission partisan. This is not about civil rights or our racial past. It's about rigging elections in the future. And no, the same filibuster that President Obama and President Biden praised when they were senators, the same filibuster that the Democrats used to kill my police reform bill last year, has not suddenly become a racist relic just because the shoe is now on the other foot. Race is not a political weapon to settle every issue the way one side wants. It's far too important. This should be a joyful springtime for our nation. This administration inherited a tide that had already turned. The coronavirus is on the run. Thanks to Operation Warp Speed and the Trump administration, our country is flooded with safe and effective vaccines. Thanks to our bipartisan work last year, job openings are rebounding. So why do we feel so divided? Anxious. A nation with so much cause for hope should not feel so heavy laden. A president who promised to bring us together should not be pushing agendas that tear us apart. The American family deserves better, and we know what better looks like. Just before COVID, we had the most inclusive economy in my lifetime, the lowest unemployment rates ever recorded for African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians, and a 70-year low nearly for women. Wages were growing faster at the bottom than at the top. The bottom 25% saw their wages go up faster than the top 25%. That happened because Republicans focused on expanding opportunity for all Americans. In addition to that, we passed opportunity zones, criminal justice reform, and permanent funding for historically Black colleges and universities for the first time ever. We fought the drug epidemic, rebuilt our military, and cut taxes for working families and single moms like the one that raised me. Our best future will not come from Washington schemes or socialist dreams. It will come from you, the American people. Black, Hispanic, white, and Asian, Republican and Democrat, brave police officers in Black neighborhoods. We are not adversaries. We are family. We are all in this together, and we get to live in the greatest country on earth. The country where my grandfather in his 94 years saw his family go from cotton to Congress in one lifetime. So I am more than hopeful. I am confident that our finest hour is yet to come. Original sin is never the end of the story, not in our souls and not for our nation. The real story is always redemption. I am standing here because my mom has prayed me through some really tough times. I believe our nation has succeeded the same way because generations of Americans in their own ways have asked for grace and God has supplied it. So I will close with a word from a worship song that really helped me through this past year of COVID. The music is new, but the words draw from Scripture. May the Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May his presence go before you and behind you and beside you. In your weeping and your rejoicing, he is for you. May his favor be upon our nation for 1,000 generations, and your family and your children and their children. Good night, and God bless the United States of America.
You've been watching South Carolina Senator Tim Scott deliver the GOP response to President Biden's first major address to a joint session of Congress. He said the president and Democrats, 3 months in, are, in his view, pulling the country further apart. He also spoke of his own experience as a Black man in the United States, saying, quote, "I know the pain of discrimination," but he said America is not a racist country, and he criticized efforts at the federal level to address voting rights. We are going to take a quick break, but we will have full analysis of President Biden's speech straight ahead. Stay with us. You're streaming CBSN. CBS News, always on.
It's a good time for people like us. Everything's starting up.
This is not just another streaming app.
You might want to hold on to something.
This is a mountain of original, bingeable entertainment.
It's just the beginning. The world is now a blank page.
That's why we're here, to save each other.
This is chilling, unsettling, and brilliantly bonkers. Oh, This is weird and hilarious, stylish and cheeky.
I imagine she dreams of casting me aside like an old shoe.
Oh, honey, you know I'd never throw away a shoe.
This is a joy to watch, a wonder to explore, and a peak TV experience.
We are such stuff as dreams are made of.
I'm so happy! Yay!
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment. Paramount Plus, now streaming.
Football, soccer, whatever you want to call it, it's huge. It's the best and biggest competition. You have a golden opportunity, now or never. Oh, yes!
Oh, they done it!
Unbelievable!
It's not over yet.
The UEFA Champions League. Stream every match live on Paramount Plus.
Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Paramount Plus. Woo! This is is strokes of genius, beautiful games, and one shining moment. This is Defenders, Investigators, and
7 strangers picked to live in a house.
This is Young SpongeBob, Young Sheldon, and Younger. This is everything you've been looking for.
That's gonna leave a mark.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment.
All right.
This is Paramount Plus, now streaming.
Whose stories are worth telling? Who's worth hearing? Never let anyone decide that for you.
This is not just another streaming app. This is love taps, death traps, and whip snaps.
Oh, shit.
This is things that go boom and things that go
Boom.
This is justice. This is fearless.
This is business.
This is all the drama you can handle.
You must go. Make your stand.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment. Paramount Plus, now streaming.
That bird has been staring at me. It's been there for 10 minutes. Okay.
I didn't know we were coming, or I'd worn pants.
You changed the rules, sir.
Oh, objection, Your Honor. That's intense.
Yeah, welcome.
Are you ready, counselor? I am, Your Honor.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thank you for joining us. In his first address to a joint session of Congress, President Biden declared that America is on the move again and said that the country was, quote, rising anew. He started by acknowledging the historic nature of the evening, noting that he was flanked by 2 women, Vice President Kamala Harris and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. The president highlighted some of the accomplishments of his first 3 months in office while speaking to more than 200 members of Congress, cabinet officials, and other guests who were all masked and socially distanced. On the coronavirus pandemic, Mr. Biden touted his administration's efforts to vaccinate Americans and relieve some of the economic impacts of the pandemic by passing the American Rescue Plan. The president discussed his administration's efforts to address infrastructure reform through his American Jobs Plan, which he said was a, quote, once-in-a-generation investment in America itself. On climate change, Mr. Biden said the best way to address the nation's climate crisis is to create jobs, and he explicitly called on Congress to pass a $15 an hour federal minimum wage. The president also unveiled his nearly $2 trillion American Families Plan, in which he proposed free preschool and for 3- and 4-year-olds, as well as 2 years of free community college for all Americans. To pay for these proposals, the president said he would raise taxes on wealthy individuals and corporations, but pledged that he would not raise taxes on anyone making under $400,000 per year. President Biden called on Congress to come together on a number of issues, including what he said was a, quote, epidemic of gun violence, as well as passing what he called comprehensive police reform.
I stand
Here's some
here
of what you
tonight,
might have missed.
1 day shy of the 100th day of my administration. 100 days since I took the oath of office and lifted my hand off our family Bible and inherited a nation, we all did, that was in crisis. The worst pandemic in a century. The worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. After I promised we'd get 100 million COVID-19 vaccine shots into people's arms in 100 days, we will have provided over 220 million COVID shots in those 100 days. We kept our commitment, Democrats and Republicans, of sending $1,400 rescue checks to 85% of American households. We've already sent more than 160 million checks out the door. In my view, we also need to make a once-in-a-generation investment in our families and our children. That's why I've introduced the American Families Plan tonight, which addresses 4 of the biggest challenges facing American families and in turn America. More than 2 weeks ago in the Rose Garden, surrounded by some of the bravest people I know, the survivors and families who lost loved ones to gun violence, I laid out several of the Department of Justice actions that are being taken to impact on this epidemic. And I'll do everything in my power to protect the American people from this epidemic of gun violence. But it's time for Congress to act as well. Immigration has always been essential to America. Let's end our exhausting war over immigration. For more than 30 years, politicians have talked about immigration reform, and we've done nothing about it. It's time to fix it. As I stand here tonight before you in a new and vital hour of life and democracy of our nation, and I can say with absolute confidence, I have never been more confident or optimistic about America.
Let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns and Major Garrett. Caitlin is CBSN's Washington reporter, and Major is our CBS News chief Washington correspondent. All right, I want to start by getting each of your reactions to President Biden's speech. Caitlin, let's start with you. What stood out to you?
Well, we've been talking all day about how this is an address to a joint session of Congress, not the State of the Union, because the president has only been in office for 100 days and hasn't presided over the country enough to assess the State of the Union. And I think it's an important distinction because the president, you heard in a few of those bites there, continued to urge Congress to act. So you could tell that he was sending a message to them, that he wants them to act on a variety of different proposals, from infrastructure to immigration to guns to even voting rights. You heard him say time and time again, just pass it. Let's act. And he also tried to appeal to their sensibilities as lawmakers by referencing many times that he had been sitting in their shoes over and over again as a member of Congress for years, of course, kind of saying, look, I know how these things work. I know how these things go. We've been working on these issues for a while. You need to pass them now. So I think there were moments where he was offering highlights of his administration that he believes and some goals of where he thinks the country should go. But it was really a direct appeal for congressional action on his priorities. And that's important because while we're only 100 days in, it doesn't seem like a lot. You know how difficult the politics become up here on Capitol Hill once we start getting into midterm election season. And there's this feeling among Democrats up here on the Hill that, look, they could lose the House next year. They could possibly lose the Senate. So why not try to get these big priorities passed now? And Republicans up here have been griping that they are not part of the conversation or haven't been able to be part of the conversation when it comes to some of these big bills. You heard that from Tim Scott, for example, in that response. And so I thought it was just really interesting the way in which he was trying to appeal directly to members of Congress.
And Major, let me ask you the same question. What stood out to you from the president's address?
Well, Elaine, with your permission, I'll talk about not only President Biden's address, but also Tim Scott's Republican response, because, yes, there were parts of both speeches that were not talking directly to each other and have fundamental disagreements. But there was also a Venn diagram sort of component to both speeches in which they were talking about the same things. So there's this part of the speech that Tim Scott and President Biden gave, that talk about the same things but come to different conclusions. What do I mean by that? Tim Scott talked about the pre-pandemic economy. Joe Biden talked about what the country learned as a result of the pandemic, that even though the wage gains that Tim Scott talked about, the low unemployment, none of that was durable in a pandemic. And the pandemic revealed that employers were not as generous to their employees as they should be, that employees on the front line suffered the most, that there were deep racial inequalities there, that women suffered as a result in the workplace. And all those things revealed by the pandemic told us something, according to President Biden and the White House, about what the pre-pandemic economy actually was. From Tim Scott's point of view, he's talking about the pre-pandemic economy as so much better, even than the economy we have now or the economy we're going to have. That's talking about the same thing, but coming to a fundamentally different conclusion. Same thing about policing reform. To Tim Scott, it's all about the details of the legislation. To Joe Biden, President Biden, and the Biden White House, it's about so much more. It's about, yes, the details of police reform, but also about systemic racism and things that have been part of the U.S. economy in relationship to people of color that have been out of balance for a very, very long time. And that's got to be addressed in addition to the details of police reform. Again, talking about the same thing in the same area, but coming to fundamentally different conclusions. One other thing I would say about Tim Scott's Republican response, and I think it's really important to note this. A couple of things not mentioned. First of all, President Trump, not referenced in any way. China, not referenced in any way. And Obamacare, not referenced in any way. Having covered the 2016 Republican nomination fight, Donald Trump becoming the nominee, and that general election campaign, to have those three things, meaning Trump not the central issue, China not a huge issue in a Republican response, and Obamacare nowhere in the conversation, also what I would say parenthetically, Tim Scott did not talk about gun control legislation or the Second Amendment in the way Donald Trump did, either as candidate or president. Those omissions, to me, are striking as the Republican Party tries to find its new way in a Biden-dominated Washington.
Right, and that was underscored by just the imagery of, you had Kevin McCarthy and you had Liz Cheney, who were socially distanced, but as some folks were talking about on Twitter.
Yes.
Exactly, making that observation as well, that the separation is vast between those two Republicans because of what you just laid out. So, Caitlin, let me ask you sort of a big picture question. You talked about the fact that President Biden laid out some of the key agenda items that he wants to pursue from this point forward. What did all of that roughly kind of outline about his vision regarding the role of government as he sees it in American society now?
You know, it's really interesting having covered Biden as a candidate. In the early days of his candidacy, he was campaigning on kind of just getting things back to normal. And a lot of progressives and liberal voters that we would talk to on the campaign trail would often say, you know, it's not enough to just get back to normal. Well, the COVID situation really kind of flipped everything on its head, and you saw in response as part of the campaign and now the presidency that because of the coronavirus pandemic and the fallout that we've seen, the economic fallout and also the disparities that we've seen this president kind of push for bigger and bolder proposals than he might have pushed for in the past. And again, there's this sense of urgency here. And I thought it was notable that, you know, when he was talking about infrastructure, for example, he said that, you know, he'd like bipartisan support, he'd like Republicans to get on board, but they still, you know, need to pass something soon. They just can't wait around. And as Major noted in our earlier conversation, this idea of what American government means and the idea that that it means the people when he's talking about it, I thought those were really resonant lines. And I also wanted to pick up on something that Tim Scott said, just to go back to that previous conversation, and how Republicans are trying to navigate this post-Trump world and what their message is. And you've seen them really lean into this culture argument. And you heard that from Tim Scott tonight, talking about things from voting rights to other issues, kind of weaving them into this culture argument. And as Republicans are trying to figure out how to, you know, pin Biden down, it seems like they find an effective message on kind of painting a broader brush here and kind of leaning into these arguments. And I think that was really interesting coming from Tim Scott, that's kind of the message that we'll likely hear from Republicans heading into the midterms, given that you know, Biden isn't necessarily, in their view, a divisive figure on his own, but these arguments being waged, they say, by the left, are kind of what they're trying to run against.
Yeah, you know, it was underscored also by Senator Scott, noting that some of the vitriol that he has received, as he said, he's been called names by the left, he said, that are part of the discrimination, he says, that he has experienced as a black man in the United States. Let's go ahead and bring in our Leslie Sanchez to this conversation. She is a CBS News political analyst. And Leslie, I want to pick up on what Caitlin was talking about, what Major was talking about a moment ago, and that is Senator Tim Scott's response to President Biden's address. Major noted some omissions in that response by Senator Scott. No mention of President Trump, no mention of guns, no mention of Obamacare. What did you hear in Senator Scott's response?
What was strikingly different, and I thought Major was exactly right to point that out, is he also came across as a very authentic figure speaking his own truth. And at this moment, that's exactly the type of voice that you want to hear, especially when people are wondering, to Caitlin's point, what is the image of this different, this new normal Republican Party? And for him to talk about issues, and this, it reminds me of, it kind of harkens back to what civil debate used to sound like, 20 years ago, if you could even say there was that. But it was an argument about, we can all agree on these problems, but the compassionate approach that perhaps you took for 4 decades, the Republicans' argument would be, didn't work, so let's try something different. And there was a through line with Senator Scott's speech that was saying very much the same thing. I've experienced the same thing. I see the world and we can share your vision of how you see the world, but the way we go about it needs to be different. So the tone of how this is different from the Republican Party is what stands out. And he being the right messenger. It's not this kind of bombastic, confrontational that we saw with the previous administration and the previous kind of tone of the Republican Party. It's getting back to a different type of balance. And I think that's going to be extremely effective for Republicans, because instead of these broad strokes like of Biden promising everything and sounding so conciliatory and wanting to have that olive branch and reach out to Republicans, but kind of bringing it back to the reality of what does and doesn't work. That's where Republicans think they can get some leverage. And they're going to aim at that and really take aim at some of these fiscal approaches, the big price tag that Biden had in his speech. And I think we'll be hearing about that over the next couple of days.
Well, Major, there was a much smaller crowd tonight, as we've noted, due to the coronavirus pandemic. And we heard the president talk about his administration's success in getting Americans vaccinated. How important was it for the president to highlight that at the beginning, really, of the address, to sort of lay that out and lay that down first as he then went on to the other points that he wanted to make? Well,
Elaine, let me answer that very good question with a question back to everyone. What would the speech have been, and what would President Biden's political prospects be if after 100 days we were still inching along at about 1 million vaccinations a day? And the death rate and infection rate and hospitalization rates were essentially only nominally better than they were in January and February, meaning that the president and his team did not meet any of the ambitious goals it set when it was inaugurated, and that there is no real prospect of turning the corner on COVID-19, that there are still hot spots and reopening is not foreseeable, and July 4th isn't going to be a metaphorical or actual Independence Day. What would we be talking about? What would be the condition politically, managerially, and effectively of this administration? It would be in the garbage can. It would be a dumpster fire. And that is what's so important about this particular moment and the ability of a address to a joint session of Congress sounding a little bit like a State of the Union address, as I predicted it would before the speech even began, because there were accomplishments aplenty referenced by the president in the opening 5 or 10 minutes, saying, look what we've already done. Look what's already happened. That sounded a little bit like a State of the Union address. And then he could declare, not that the State of the Union is strong, he can't do that yet, but he said, America's moving and we're moving forward. That sounds very much like the opening stanzas of a State of the Union address, and he would not be there if this administration had fallen flat on its face, doing the very things it said was most important to its political, managerial, and administrative future, getting its arms around the pandemic. So I answer your question with a question back to the panel. What would we be talking about if this administration had stumbled and mishandled and fumbled all the things it promised to do?
Point taken, Major. It is something that, no doubt, we would be having a very different conversation tonight if that were the case. I want to turn to Control Room. I want to ask for SOT 9 here shortly. The notion of the president looking at education in America in a different way is something that has gotten a lot of attention and a lot of focus. President Biden talked about how early childhood education, according to research, has demonstrated success later for individuals in life. And in making that pitch for what he calls the American Families Plan, suggested this is something that was not an option, but that was necessary for the United States in order to be competitive on the world stage. So let's go ahead and play part of what the president said on that front. SOT 9 control room.
That's why my American Families Plan guarantees 4 additional years of public education for every person in America, starting as early as we can. The great universities in this country have conducted studies of the last 10 years. It shows that adding 2 years of universal high-quality preschool for every 3-year-old and 4-year-old, no matter what background they come from, puts them in the position to be able to compete all the way through 12 years and increases exponentially their prospect of graduating and going on beyond graduation. The research shows when a young child goes to school, not daycare, they're far more likely to graduate from high school and go to college or something after high school.
All right, let's bring into this conversation Joel Payne. He is a CBS News political analyst and a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Apologies, Joel, work from home problems here. But we heard that SOT from President Biden in reimagining and rethinking the way American education is thought of in this country. Tell me about the idea of the way that's being received right now in the circles that you have been sort of traveling in and hearing from. This is something that the president pointed to research, as I suggested before the SOT played, indicating that this will allow success down the road for Americans and therefore success for the country in competing on the world stage.
Yeah, the president was very aspirational tonight, both in talking about his plans and also talking about a lot of the issues that he's hearing about in the first 100 days of his presidency. There are things that he hasn't had a chance to get to. I think he spent most of the second half of that speech talking about other topics he wants to focus on, like what you're discussing. He obviously talked about police reform. He talked about a lot of foreign affairs issues. But I think with this, I think it's really a theme throughout the Biden presidency and throughout this speech. And I think it's bringing the temperature down and creating hope and creating something for people to look forward to, really speaking aspirationally. And I think you heard the president do that a lot. That is very consistent with his style, and it's been pretty successful for him if you look at his poll numbers and you look at his standing right now politically throughout the country, and I think he's hoping that that continues throughout.
Leslie, I'm curious, is universal preschool a place where perhaps there could be some bipartisan agreement?
There certainly has been a lot of agreement, evidence-based research to support the idea of exactly what he's talking about, especially for underserved communities, many lower-income communities that do not have access because of financial limitation to put their children in quality a preschool or Montessori or any resources that more affluent families have. This could balance out because those educational disparities only get larger as the children grow and move, and the risk of dropouts, high school dropouts, and the things the president was talking about are very real. I was paying a lot of attention to the last part of his 4-year plan, which was the 2 years of, I believe, community college or free education, sounding very much like the progressive left talking about it again. That's where Republicans start, wringing their hands. What is the cost? Would this be for everyone? It really destabilizes the current higher education system in a way where you're penalizing the haves and have-nots. So that's the part I feel Republicans are going to pay attention to. It's a really good concept in theory, but again, how would you pay for it, and who would be best served by that plan?
Leslie, we also heard the president touch on immigration reform, and I want to read part of a statement. This is from Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. It reads in part, quote, "While I share President Biden's urgency in fixing our broken immigration system, what I didn't hear tonight was a plan to address the immediate crisis at the border, and I will continue holding this administration accountable to deliver the resources and staffing necessary for a humane, orderly process as we work to improve border security, support local economies, and fix our immigration system." Let me ask you, Leslie, from your vantage point, is there any way at all for Republicans and Democrats to work together on this issue, even when members of the president's own party are not satisfied with how he's handling the current situation?
It gets incredibly political. I want to be the hopeful one, Elaine, because something needs to be done urgently for the people for the crisis that is falling squarely on the shoulders of this administration. There is a clear message and an understanding that by removing some of Trump's executive orders and his policies, that it has caused this flood on the border. The Republicans want this crisis to move into a phase where they can understand what is going to be done. Are there going to be more asylum judges? Are you going to move more resources to kind of manage the flow? Is there going to be a system? And the question is going to be, is it going to be under the auspices of comprehensive immigration reform, kind of a one big solution, or are they going to parse this out, which has never been successful? And who's going to champion that? So the president's going to have to take leadership. Again, there's a lot of sour attitudes about it because under President Obama, there was supposed to be immigration reform in the first 100 days, and it just never transpired. So a lot of people feel that that's not a genuine approach by the Democrats, and they want and are looking for something different. And that's on the Democratic side, and Republicans are certainly going to focus on border security before they focus on anything else.
Elaine, can I jump in real quick?
Please.
So I said before the speech that was one thing I was going to look for, what the president did or didn't say about immigration. Now, no one cares what I'm wanting to hear, but it sounds like Senator Mark Kelly wanted to hear things too. And I guarantee you Henry Cuellar, Democrat from Texas, who was on the takeout with me last week, wanted to hear something too. And I guarantee you they're both dissatisfied for the same reason. Because from their vantage point, and I would say, and I will defer to Caitlin on this because she's up on the Hill much more frequently than I am, most moderate Democrats who feel that they're going to face a tough re-election in 2022 wanted to hear the president say all the things he said aspirationally about immigration, but also they wanted him to say, hey, we have a problem. It's a problem right now. Here's why we have the problem. Here's how I'm trying to manage it. And here's what I think the next 3 or 4 months are going to look like and how I'm going to manage it going forward. Without referencing what's going on the border right now, more than 22,000 unaccompanied children in the custody of Health and Human Services, 1,000 in Border Patrol facilities, that's a problem. That is a serious management problem. It's a humanitarian issue. Are they being tested? Are they not being tested? Why can't the media get in to see them? What's the transparency? These are real issues. These are not phony, made-up issues. And I guarantee you one of the things that Senator Kelly from Arizona is criticizing this administration about is you didn't even reference it. This is happening right now. It's happening in his state. It's happening in neighboring New Mexico, California, and Texas. And that problem needs to have some voice placed behind it for the President of the United States. Not just saying, oh, Kamala Harris is going to be our diplomatic liaison with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. That's fine. But what does that have to do, and how are you explaining it in a practical, understandable way to Americans who look at these numbers and say, that doesn't look right to me? And the polling data, as I suggested before the speech, in one area and one area alone for this administration is distinctly underwater, and it's on the management of the southern border. And Mark Kelly's statement reflects that level of Democratic anxiety. It's not shared by all Democrats. I wouldn't suggest that it is. But that it's shared by Mark Kelly is an indication that other Democrats wanted to hear more than they heard tonight.
And it's something that we're going to continue to
Elaine,
watch.
Can I?
Yes, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you know, Major started by saying what would happen if he hadn't really had success on the vaccinations. The president made a focus of the pandemic and the vaccinations and moving that forward. And there was a plan and a team, and he was involved in it day by day. And the delta between that type of action and management that Major talked about, and what you don't see on immigration just shows you there's not an intention or a seriousness in resolving that, which is really kind of the point. And that neither the president or the vice president have gone to the border, and all of these calls have been taken. But it just shows you when the president wants to focus on something, they can be very effective at it, and it's just silence and crickets on, with respect to the crisis on the border.
And we'll see if the reaction from. Yeah, go ahead, Caitlin, please.
Oh, just quickly to jump in and kind of talk about the dynamics here on the Hill that Major mentioned. Absolutely, among Democrats and Republicans feel very little political incentive to work on immigration reform up here because of what's happening on the border. Earlier today, I talked to Congressman Mike McCall, who now is the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but previously he was the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. And I asked him, are Republicans willing to get on board with some immigration reform? And he said, to be honest with you, not really, because of what's happening on the border. There's just no political incentive there. So this is the problem facing this administration, if they want to get something done on immigration, is not only holding the Democratic caucus together, but getting any sort of support. And that's why last week you saw members from the Hispanic caucus go to the White House and urge the president to consider, supporting something through reconciliation on immigration, because they kind of, realize it's going to be very difficult to get support. And the political incentives here on the Hill have changed so dramatically on immigration over the past few years. I know we all covered the passage of comprehensive immigration reform in the Senate several years ago, but that was in reaction to Republicans losing the 2012 election and feeling like they needed to gain back voters. The dynamic is completely different after Trump, and Republicans say, hey, look, we gained Latino voters in the past election, and then they haven't really paid a price for their stances on immigration. Those are just kind of the dynamics up here that lawmakers, talk openly about.
Yeah, we have been watching Camilo Montoya Galvez, our CBS News immigration reporter, who has been reporting from the U.S. southern border. There is no doubt what is taking place there is an urgent situation. Caitlin Huey-Burns, Major Garrett, Leslie Sanchez, and Joel Payne. So great to see you all again. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we have a bit of insight into how some Americans felt about President Biden's speech to Congress. CBS News Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, joins me now. Hi there, Anthony. So how have Americans been responding to the president's address?
Hey there, Elaine. You all were talking about the president's polling in the last segment, so that was a very nice segue here because we have some new polling. What we did was we talked to a sample, representative sample of the audience nationwide who watched the speech, and they liked what they heard. We got 85% approving of the speech. Now, I've got to add right off the bat here that, as is typical with presidential speeches, a lot of his own partisans made up the bulk of the audience. So this audience was majority Democrats watching it. And, for context, back when President Trump was giving speeches, a lot of Republicans watched those. So you've got to know that behind these numbers. But that said, the audience said that they liked what they heard. And then how did they describe it? Well, this is a word we've found in other polling. And again, in this one, people using to describe Joe Biden: presidential, caring in this case. Many thought the speech was inspiring. And then this one, folks have been talking about where his plans, big, were the things that people wanted. And this word bold was used by 80% of the audience, too. So to that extent, he kind of hit his mark. If he wanted to convey bold, it seems like he did, Elaine.
Interesting. Well, what did people make, Anthony, of the tone of President Biden's speech? Did they feel he was unifying in his remarks?
Yes, that also came up. We also did see unifying. And of course, that's been one of his campaign promises, right? To be unifying to the country, to reach out, to be bipartisan. And we've seen in the national polling that led up to this, people did think that he was reaching out to Republicans. And I want to show you this, too, because, look, the pocketbook always matters for voters, right? Is this going to be something that helps you? Well, in this case, among speech watchers, we got this 74% who told us tonight that they thought that what Joe Biden proposed was something that would directly help them. So again, very receptive. And I want to add this, Elaine, because this was really interesting. You all noted throughout the evening that this was an historic night, right? In that the women were vice president and Speaker of the House sitting there with Joe Biden, and 73% of speech watchers said that made them feel proud.
So interesting, Anthony. Well, can you walk us through how you're able to compile this data so quickly? Because it wasn't that long ago that the president wrapped up his speech.
That's right. And thank you for that. So what happens is, in the lead up to the speech and the days leading up to it, we do a nationally representative sample of people, and we ask them if they're going to watch the speech. And then if they are, we ask them if they'll take a survey right after it. And if they agree to that, then when the speech is over, we ping them right back. They get an email, they get an alert, and they take the speech, they take the poll right after the speech and tell us what they thought. So we balance that so that it is representative of all speech watchers, no matter what their composition was going to be. And then they tell us what they thought. Like I said, one of the things that stands out always is that the president's own partisans watch. So again, in this case, a lot of Democrats were watching, so a lot of Democrats were weighing in here, but that's par for the course. That is par for the course. And so overall, you get that audience that says, okay, they like what they heard, as is also par for the course, as is also very typical in a lot of these speeches, Elaine.
All right, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Thanks.
President Biden's first address lasted a little more than an hour. As he has done numerous times before, he spoke directly to Americans and related to them on a personal level, especially when it comes to losing a loved one. For more, let's bring in Cody Keenan. Cody was a chief speechwriter for former President Obama. He's also a partner at Fenway Strategies and a professor at Northwestern University. Cody, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. So what stood out to you most about the language that the president employed in his address and how the speech was written?
Yeah, it was actually about what I expected in terms of the language. You know, it was clear, it was simple, it was concise, it was accessible. It was Joe Biden. He has a good conversational style about him that I think really works with people, you know, whether he's talking about cancer in his son or, you know, his son serving abroad. When he's talking about, you know, the dose of hope right up top, he's just really good in those situations. And I'm heartened by that polling, but I also expected it. You know, he did, everyone's talking about how he laid out this big, bold agenda, but he also made it seem really doable and practical. He just has a way of asking, you know, why don't we have childcare, you know, for every parent? Why don't we have the opportunity to go to community college for free? In a way that people say, yeah, why don't we do those things? That makes sense. And it's just, his style really worked well. And I actually think that having fewer people in the chamber worked really well. It helped him with his delivery. He was able to almost whisper at times. I commented to my wife that he and Michelle Obama both have a skill where they can kind of ride a line or two on a whisper that make you lean in closer to the television screen.
That's such an interesting observation, Cody. I hadn't thought about that. I wondered what that dynamic, as different as it was, how that was going to affect him. Because in speaking to some of our correspondents who have covered him during the campaign, for instance, they talked about how he was very much affected once the COVID protocols went into place and there was, social distance requirements, all of that. And it seemed to sap a little bit of energy. That was their observation, because he has been used to those crowds and sort of taking the energy. But you're saying that that quieter tone was a more effective kind of strategy almost in this particular setting at this time.
I think so. You know, I was hopeful, as a speechwriter, I was hopeful that a smaller crowd would eliminate some of the performative applause after every line. We never liked that. It adds
no such luck, Cody.
No such luck. You still got it, which made the speech kind of stretch out. But without that big audience, he seemed to fill the room in a way that you can't always when there are 1,600 people crammed in there. And, you know, it seemed like a much more intimate bond between the speaker and the audience in a way that I think served him really well.
You know, it's interesting because we're used to also in these addresses, there being in the executive box, people who represent those stories. You know, the president peppered his address with the anecdotes of the individuals that he's met. And in typical times, those people would be seated there to reference. What did you make of the absence of that? Did that seem in any way to detract? Do you think it would have been better to have people there? I'm just curious because it was a certain rhythm that was different, not having those people to reference.
Yeah, I actually did not miss it. You know, that box has been a tradition since the Reagan administration. It was, I think his name was Lenny Skutnik, was a pedestrian who pulled passengers out of the Potomac after a plane crash, and he was up in the box. And every president's done that since. We certainly did it every time. And you can find some really wonderful stories of heroism to work into a speech, sometimes in ways that bolster your policy. But I liked not having it. I thought it gave his ending more power and punch about what our democracy could be without having to, you know, lean on other stories as good as they might be. It was all Joe Biden all the way to the end. And, you know, you always hear people questioning his stamina and whatnot. He just gave an hour-and-a-half speech almost without taking a break. And that, I can tell you, that's a tough thing to pull off.
Cody, just some mechanical questions here. How long does it take to write a speech like this typically? And based on what you know about the president, how much do you think President Biden was involved with the writing process for this?
Yeah, for a speechwriter with the State of the Union address, time has no meaning. It just becomes this endless loop. So we would typically start drafting about 2 weeks out, give it to the president a week out. And then each day is just kind of this eternal slog, working with policy teams and fact checkers and the president. And then if the president wants to rework it in the last couple of days, that's like a whole week crammed into a day. So that's what I mean by time has no meaning. But I didn't get the sense that it happened to them on this one, that there had to be a lot of rewrites at the end. I do know from speaking with his team that the president was highly involved and engaged, and you could tell. And, you know, they send out the text beforehand, and he went off script a few times, I think, all in ways that helped the speech.
All right, well, as someone who has had to write for some long-form projects, in addition to day of deadlines, the eternal slog feels very resonant with me. Cody Keenan, a pleasure to talk to you, Cody. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And if you missed President Biden's first major address to Congress, we will be re-airing his speech in its entirety. You can watch that at midnight and again at 3 a.m. Eastern. That's right here on CBSN. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll have the rest of the day's news straight ahead. You're streaming CBSN. CBS News, always on.
Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Paramount Plus. This is strokes of genius, beautiful games, and one shining moment. This is Defenders, Investigators, and
7 strangers picked to live in a house.
This is young SpongeBob, young Sheldon, and younger. This is everything you've been looking for.
That's gonna leave a mark.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment.
All right.
This is